This channel is part of the History Hit network.
This is a series about an artistic era that's looked down on and never gets the respect it deserves. It's a shadowy era, so shadowy people even disagree about its name. So I'm going to use the old one, the one that best sums up its dilemmas. I'm going to call it the Dark Ages.
Dark Ages go roughly from the 4th century to roughly the 11th. They begin when the Roman Empire starts to crumble, and they end when William the Conqueror invades England. Now, in this shadowy slab of time, everything changed. The greatest empire the world has seen melted back into the cultural shadows, and various powerful artistic forces stepped up to take its place.
Later in the series, we'll be examining those much misunderstood creatives, the barbarians. What wondrous bling they brought into the world. What fabulous things they achieved.
I'll also be looking at that joyous and inventive religion, Islam, which did so much to light up the Dark Ages. But we begin with a group of people whose achievements were enormous. They started with nothing and ended up with so much. I'm thinking, of course, of those thoroughly underestimated Dark Age creatives, those intrepid voyagers into the unknown. The Christians.
Art never lies. And the story that art tells us of these exciting times is that this was never an age of darkness. This was an age of light.
These are the famous ruins of Pompeii, and as I'm sure you know, Mount Vesuvius erupted here in 79 AD, and all this was covered in ashes and preserved for posterity in perfect conditions. Now, one of the things they found here, which really surprised them, was proof that there were already Christians here by 79 AD. And the thing they found that proved it was this.
It's what they call a rotas square. And these rotas squares are deeply mysterious.
They've been found all over the Roman Empire, in Syria, in Gaul, even in England, in Cirencester. They found one of these, and they're usually inscribed on the walls of houses, or sometimes on the columns outside the house. And of course, when they found them, they didn't have a clue what these were. Just mysterious word games plastered outside houses.
What it is a letter square made up of 5 Latin words: rotas, opera, tenet, arepo, and sator.
If you love history, Then you'll love History Hit. We have tons of exclusive documentaries about the most important people in history that you will not find anywhere else. With documentaries featuring great medieval figures and events from the Battle of Hastings to the last of the Vikings, History Hit has unrivaled access to peerless archival materials and the world's best historians. We're committed to bringing history fans award-winning documentaries and podcasts that you cannot find anywhere else. Sign up now for a 14-day free trial, and Chronicle fans get 50% off their first 3 months. Just be sure to use the code Chronicle at checkout.
Rotas at the top is Sator backwards. And you can see Rotas down this side as well, and Sator down that side. And here in the middle, Arepo is opera, work, backwards. The actual words mean something like, as ye sow, so shall ye reap. But only if you ignore Latin grammar. Various code breakers twisted it this way and that for decades, but it still didn't mean much. But then, a eureka moment. One of these code breakers realised that the important thing about the Rotas square was not the words, but the letters. Because these letters of the Rotas square can be rearranged to form a cross, which reads the same both ways, up and down. And it says Pater Noster, which is Latin for Our Father, the opening words of the Lord's Prayer. What's more, these two letters that are left over, Alpha and Omega, are the first and last letters of the Greek alphabet. Alpha and Omega in their Roman form. You can see them down in the Roman catacombs, popping up everywhere. Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. Popular Christian code for the one true God. So these mysterious word squares were put outside houses to signify that the occupants were Christians, and also as a kind of lucky charm to ward off evil. Of course, this isn't art yet. This is an inscription, but it has artistic implications. What you see in here, this appetite for signs and symbols and secret meanings, that Christian appetite is something that transferred to Christian art. The Christian art of the Dark Ages is an art of mystery and magic, of suggestions and miracles, transcendence and light. The Rotas square isn't art yet, but it is an excellent pointer to a new artistic direction. One of the reasons early Christian art is so exciting is because you find it in exciting places. Rome is wild enough on the surface, but when you descend into its underground, look how scary and fascinating it becomes. People often imagine the catacombs were hiding places, underground shelters in which persecuted Christians hid from the Romans. But you can't hide an underground city as huge as this under anyone's nose. The Romans knew these were here all right. What they didn't know is what one Christian was saying to another down here. Because the first Christian art was filled with secret signs and hidden meanings. That's why the fish became an ubiquitous Christian symbol. When two Christians met on the road, it's said that one of them would draw this shape in the sand, and the other one would draw this shape. And the two of them knew immediately that they were Christians together. This famous Christian sign, the Christogram, or Chi Rho, represents Jesus himself. It's made by combining two Greek letters, Chi and Rho, the first two letters of the word Christos, which means the anointed one. It's said the sign had magic powers. Even today, we still call Christmas Xmas because of this. Another popular Christian sign was the anchor, for the simple reason that the top of it here looked like a cross. Everywhere you look in these haunting Roman catacombs, the first Christians are declaring their faith in such mysterious and cryptic ways. These symbols and signs weren't just a secret language, they're also a different way of seeing things, a different way of understanding, not just with your eyes, but with your imagination. And what's most interesting about this first Christian art you find down here is how few pictures there are in it. No images of Jesus, no Marys, no saints. For the first few centuries of Christianity, there were no Christian images. It's not till the beginning of our period, the so-called Dark Ages, 300 years after the birth of Christ, that figures and scenes begin to pop up at last in Christian art. And look how puzzling they were. We're in a 3rd century Christian burial chamber in the catacombs of Priscilla. A rich Christian family was buried here. And look what's on the walls. Over here, some peacocks. Over there, 3 chaps standing in a fire. And over here, some kind of sea dragon with someone coming out of its mouth. So let's decode all this. The peacocks are symbols of eternity. Because peacocks replace their beautiful feathers every year, the ancients believed their flesh couldn't rot. It was eternal. The 3 young men are described in the Bible by the prophet Daniel. 3 young Israelites were set on fire by the Babylonians, but God protected them, and the Babylonian fires couldn't touch them. The chap coming out of the sea monster is the prophet Jonah, who you may remember was swallowed by a whale for 3 whole days. After 3 days, the whale spat him out again, and he returned to dry land, a wiser man. The thread that unites all these cryptic images is salvation, hope. God saved the 3 young men from the fire. He saved Jonah from the whale, and he'll save you too. Jonah is also the subject of the earliest surviving masterpieces of Christian sculpture, found today in the Cleveland Museum of Art. Jonah swallowed by the whale, spat out by the whale, and returned to dry land a wiser man. Jonah is particularly significant because the early Christians used him as a stand-in for Jesus himself. Jesus, remember, also rose from the dead after 3 days. And the reason why Jonah is so popular in the catacombs is because he's a way of showing Jesus without showing Jesus. A replacement, another code, a symbol. We've been down here, 5 minutes? Yet look how many different ways we've already seen to represent Jesus without actually showing him. He's the Kiro, the word sign. He's Jonah in the whale. He's the fish, the anchor. What we haven't seen yet is a Jesus we can all recognize. A Jesus who actually looks like Jesus. The truth is, no one in early Christian art had a clue what he actually looked like. The Bible doesn't describe him, no one does. So art took an extremely long time to come up with a face for Jesus. And I think the search for that face is the greatest artistic tussle of the Dark Ages. The proof that no one actually knew what Jesus looked like is this controversial relic, the Shroud of Turin. It's said to be the cloth in which Jesus was wrapped at his death. And this haunting likeness is the true face of Christ, preserved miraculously in his blood. Or so they say. The Shroud of Turin doesn't get shown very often, but when it does, thousands of pilgrims flock to Turin to see it, and most of them believe they're looking at the true face of Christ. When I went to see it, there was such a powerful atmosphere in the church. So many people, so certain they were staring at the remains of Jesus. But I'm afraid they weren't, because Jesus Christ didn't look like that. At least, not according to the evidence left behind by the first Christian artists who described him. According to these first Christian artists, Jesus actually looked like this. Blonde, fresh-faced, boyish. The earliest images of Jesus look nothing like the Jesus we know today. And nothing like the Jesus on the Turin Shroud. Jesus, at first, is a happy-go-lucky character. Curly-haired and handsome. He's usually shown waving his wand about, performing remarkable miracles. So here, he's turning water into wine at the wedding feast at Cana. And here, he's curing the paralytic who couldn't walk until he met the baby-faced Jesus. And over here, the blind man is being cured by Jesus again. And finally, with a wave of that Harry Potter wand of his, this is Jesus raising Lazarus from the dead. And you can always tell Lazarus in early Christian art because he looks like an Egyptian mummy, all wrapped up. What you never see in these very first examples of Christian art is a Jesus who's suffering, in pain, covered in blood, like the one on the Turin Shroud. That Jesus doesn't turn up in art for 1,000 years or so, because the tortured Jesus is a creation of the Middle Ages, an expression of medieval guilt and terror. What horrible pains the artistic mind went on to inflict on the crucified Jesus in the centuries ahead. How harshly it whipped him and scourged him and punctured him. In the beginning, though, artists didn't do that. The first Jesuses in art are young and handsome, curly-haired and free. So, either Jesus deliberately misled his followers about what he actually looked like for the first 1,000 years or so of Christianity, or the Turin Shroud is a medieval fake. I know what I think. The first Christians weren't looking for a God who made them feel guilty. That would never have caught on. They were looking for a God who would save them and fill them with hope. So as their model for the first Jesus, Christian artists selected the youngest and handsomest of the pagan gods. They chose Apollo, the god of the sun. Blonde and unbearded, youthful and curly-haired. Apollo was a god who made you feel good. So the first Jesuses were curly-haired and pretty because they borrowed that look from Apollo, and it went further than that. When this mysterious Christian statue was dug up out of the ground, it was thought to represent a woman, an unknown goddess, a muse. Only later was it realized that this too was an early Jesus. In that wonderful museum in Cleveland, the one with the Jonah marbles, there's a carving of Apollo performing a miracle with Nike, the goddess of victory. Apollo is the robed figure on the left. And look how shapely he is. How easily we might mistake him too for a woman. Pagan gods could be male and female. They could amalgamate the sexes and represent both genders at once, just like this Jesus here. Extraordinary as it sounds, the first Jesuses were sometimes made to look feminine on purpose. They were given suggestions of breasts, beautiful faces, soft bodies and long hair. There is neither male nor female, wrote St. Paul to the Galatians. You are all one in Jesus. The pagans had lots of goddesses to worship, Venus, Isis, Diana, but Christianity had none. Christianity believed in one true God, and he was masculine. There was an entire feminine side missing. So the feminization of Jesus was a deliberate artistic attempt to cater for both sexes. It produced some of the Dark Ages' most unexpected imagery. In Ravenna, in the magnificent Aryan baptistry, there's an unbearded Jesus being baptized in the River Jordan. And he's so soft and feminine. A podgy and delicate Christ with childbearing hips. Before this girlish Jesus could become fully masculine, grow a beard and turn into a man, Christianity needed to find a feminine presence of its own. The borrowing of Christ's face from Apollo shouldn't really surprise us. The early Christians borrowed from the pagans because that's what art does. It uses what's already there. It's important to remember too that for most of these early centuries of Christianity, Christians and pagans lived together in reasonable harmony. Those terrible periods of persecution when the Romans murdered the Christians in terrible ways, those were rare, the exception, not the rule. Later, when the Roman Empire became officially Christian under the Emperor Constantine, Aggressive Christian writers looking back on these times did what the victor always does in a war. They rewrote history from their point of view, dramatised it, exaggerated it. In most of the Roman Empire, particularly at the borders, like here in Roman Syria, pagans lived next door to Christians, Christians lived next door to Jews, and all of them muddled along together. The earliest known Christian church has been found in the Syrian border town of Dura Europos. It was next to the earliest known synagogue. And around the corner was the temple of the bull god, Mithras. All these different religions swapped each other's converts, borrowed each other's gods, and influenced each other's art. Take the halo, that miraculous circle of light that you see around the heads of holy figures in Christian art. At first, there were no halos. Jesus was the magician with the wand, and that was enough to differentiate him. But as Christian art grew busier and more characters popped up in it, Jesus needed to look more obviously divine. So Christian artists did what the pagans did. They gave him a halo, borrowed once again from Apollo. Long before Jesus acquired his miraculous nimbus of light, Apollo already had one. A circle of symbolic sunshine emanating from his head to signify his solar divinity. Another crucial borrowing from the pagans was the image of the angel. If you look at a typical Roman sarcophagus of the early Christian era, you'll usually see a pair of winged figures carrying a portrait of the deceased upwards in glory. They look exactly like angels, but they're not. They're Roman figures of victory, Nikes, pagan transporters of the soul. But the most significant of these pagan borrowings was a female figure adapted from Egyptian art. She became very popular in Christianity. Indeed, she was central to it. But that's not how she began. The Egyptian Earth Mother, Isis, was one of the most revered of all pagan gods. She was the goddess of fertility, the mother goddess, from whom all life originally sprang. When you wanted babies, you prayed to Isis. When you wanted your crops to grow, you prayed to Isis. Whoever you were, slave, servant, outcast, you prayed to Isis, because Isis would protect you. To emphasize her caring nature, Isis was often shown with a baby on her knee, whom she breastfeeds regally. He's Horus, son of Isis. Horus was the god of the sky, the Egyptian Apollo, and his birthday fell at the winter solstice, sometime around December the 25th. When Christian art grew hungry for a distinct female presence to worship, a mother goddess who nurtured you and protected you, Isis, the mother of Horus, was an obvious model, and the two of them were soon successfully transported into Christian art. This is the first known image of Mary holding the baby Jesus on her lap. It was found in the Roman catacombs of Priscilla, a touching fragment of a mother and her child. Mary, caring for the baby Jesus, became one of the most popular of all the Christian images of the Dark Ages, with such glorious results. This great artistic discovery of the Virgin Mary had an important byproduct, because it did away with the need to feminize or soften Jesus. When Mary emerged as a powerful divine presence, Jesus no longer needed to be girlish. His image was free to become fully masculine. But where to put all this powerful new art that Christianity was inventing? It's all very well finding a new image for Jesus and Mary, but what also needed to be invented was the Christian church. The Roman Empire was huge. It stretched from the Middle East at one end to this primitive cultural backwater at the other, the place we now call Britain. When you're imagining the Roman Empire, you need to stop thinking about countries, because there weren't any. No clear divisions either between Asia and Africa or Europe. All of them were part of this massive collar of power surrounding the entire Mediterranean, the mightiest empire the world has seen. Christianity got to Britain quite early, all the way from over here right up to here. And just about there, in a village in Dorset called Hinton St Mary, they've dug up one of the earliest mosaic images of Jesus. He looks stately, doesn't he? More like a Roman senator than a Christian god. Except for the large key row that surrounds his head, the sign of Christ. This is Lullingstone in Kent, and we're here because I wanted you to see what's left of one of the earliest known Christian churches. If you're thinking to yourself that this looks more like the remains of a big house, not a church, you'd be absolutely right. The first churches were ordinary houses adapted for Christian use. Some Christians were richer and more active in the community than others, and their house became the neighbourhood house church. The house church they found in Dura Europos, the one next door to the Jewish synagogue, was just a small townhouse in which the Christians had done some DIY, knocked down a wall, roofed over a courtyard to create more space for their meetings. On the walls of this makeshift church, the Dura Christians painted Christ walking on water. And there he is again, healing a cripple, making him walk too. Here in Lullingstone, the house church was on the first floor of this elegant Roman villa. It was just above that pagan shrine there. Basically, it was a simple room with painted walls. Decorating it was a procession of praying Christians with crosses on their robes. There was also a key row, and around this key row, the two momentous letters of the Greek alphabet again, Alpha and Omega, the beginning and the end. If you put all those four letters together, Alpha, Rho, Chi, and Omega, you get the word Archo, which means I rule. From the outside, you wouldn't have known the Lullingstone house church was there. It was a modest Christian conversion and almost invisible. And for the first 300 years, all churches were like this. Humble spaces in people's houses, wonky bits of DIY where Christians could worship and celebrate. And then, in 313 AD, Constantine the Great converted to Christianity, and everything changed. Suddenly, this cryptic and secretive religion, with its instinctive fondness for codes and clues, became the official religion of the Roman Empire. And modesty was no longer an option. Ooh, he's a big one, isn't he? Constantine the Great, Roman Emperor, mighty warrior, and defender of the faith. Constantine's mother, St. Helena, was a Christian, and he probably inherited the faith from her. In 313 AD, Constantine's famous Edict of Milan made Christianity legal in the Roman Empire. And from then on, its power grew and grew and grew. Constantine was a builder by instinct. Look at this magnificent triumphal arch he plonked in front of the Colosseum. But his greatest achievement as a builder was the unexpected invention of the Christian church. Until Constantine, Christian churches were small and makeshift, often hidden away. But when Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Emperor, everything changed. Suddenly, all the building resources of the mightiest empire the world has seen began to be lavished on Christian architecture. And a religion which had hitherto made do with wonky house churches found itself having to invent a grand new style of worship. These huge Christian basilicas that Constantine began building were another Christian achievement for which there was no precedent. The little house churches were useless as an example for these giant halls of worship. This was a completely new kind of architecture. This is Santa Sabina in Rome, the best preserved of the first Christian basilicas. It's a new type of religious space. No one in any religion had worshipped like this before. Pagan temples worked very differently from a Christian church. Pagan temples were spaces for worshipping outdoors. In a pagan temple, the congregation stayed outside. Only the priests of the cult could enter the holy sanctuary in which the sacred idol was kept. Christian churches were the opposite. A Christian church was a huge assembly hall with a roof where people could worship indoors. And the style of worship was different too. Nowadays, churches have these neat rows of pews where everybody sits quietly and piously. But in the first Christian churches, there were no pews. In the beginning, Christian churches were huge open spaces in which an ecstatic Christian crowd would heave and circulate. This was a space for moving and chanting and talking. At the start of the ceremony, the priests would enter in a magnificent procession that went all the way up to the front. You see them illustrated sometimes high up on Christian walls. an ornate and stately priesthood progressing through these new naves in a magnificent wave of finery and colour. So these were spaces full of constant movement and chaotic crowding. And the only precedent for such a building was a useful Roman construction called a basilica. Basilicas were public meeting halls built to house big crowds. There was nothing religious about them. Every sizable Roman settlement had a basilica. Roman basilicas were entered from the side, somewhere about here. But when the Christians took over the shape, they swiveled it around and put the entrance over here. So the entire building pointed that way. One of the most common uses of a Roman basilica was as a law court. The populace would mill about down here, while the magistrate would sit up at the end, raised on a magisterial throne, sitting in a special rounded apse that signalled his importance. The Christians took over the magistrate's apse as well. It's where they put their sacrificial altar, and above it, a great Abs Mosaic, the climactic moment of this magnificent religious journey. But you're looking up at this glorious Abs Mosaic, and you're thinking, there's Jesus with a big beard. What happened to the curly-haired boy? Well, he just wasn't grand enough for Constantine's new basilicas. So the early Christians wanted a god they could look up to, a god who was a match for all the other gods. And when the time came for a more imposing Jesus to emerge, Jesus the adult, the Christians turned once again to that reliable source of raw materials that lay all around them: the art of the pagans. The most powerful and important of all the Roman gods was Jupiter, or in his Greek incarnation, Zeus, king of the gods. Zeus, or Jupiter, was grand and bearded. In the great temple of Zeus at Olympia, the most famous sculptor of the classical age, Phidias, had shown the king of the gods enthroned in majesty, an image the Christians were determined to match. They took it all: the beard, the hair, the throne, that sense of omnipotent power. It was all borrowed from Zeus. And the curly-haired youth with the girlish body who'd buzzed around performing all those miracles was replaced by this manly, mature Jesus who sits in judgment on his flock, stern and unsmiling, wise and infallible. Meanwhile, back down in the Roman catacombs, darker Christian forces were also stirring. When I said the persecution of the Christians has been exaggerated, I didn't mean it never happened. Of course it did, particularly under Constantine's predecessor, Diocletian, though not perhaps in the numbers we've been led to believe. Some estimates say that only about 2,000 Christians were killed in the Roman persecutions. I think there must have been more than that. But the modern age is definitely better at killing Christians than the Romans ever were. In the Spanish Civil War, 7,000 priests, monks and nuns were murdered. And you never hear about them. But for the early Christians, death had a special significance. The idea took hold in their imaginations that suffering was a necessary part of redemption. It was crucial. And this belief in death had a profound influence on their art and their architecture. These are the catacombs of St. Agnes of Rome. She's the patron saint of chastity, of teenage girls, engaged couples, rape victims, and virgins. Agnes was a 13-year-old girl murdered in the reign of Diocletian. The story goes that a Roman prefect wanted her to marry his son, but Agnes was a Christian. She refused. So the Roman prefect condemned her to death. Roman law didn't permit the execution of virgins. So Agnes was stripped, paraded naked through the streets, and dragged to a brothel. Afterwards, they tried to burn her, but the flames wouldn't touch her, and everyone who looked at her naked body was blinded. In the end, a Roman soldier beheaded her, and her body, decapitated, is kept here in this church. But her skull, that's in Sant'Agnese in Piazza Navona, where the faithful come to kneel before it and worship it. Martyrs like Agnes were believed to offer special protection for the early Christians. They were baptized in blood and sat next to God in the next world. If a martyr favored you, you too were guaranteed a place in heaven. To improve their chances of salvation, every Christian wanted to be buried as close to a martyr as possible. And so the catacombs became a very desirable piece of real estate. Directly above Agnes's tomb are the ruins of a giant funeral basilica. All this was once covered in Christian graves. But the building I really want to show you is this one, the one next door to the basilica. This is Santa Constanza. It's a Christian church now, but originally this was a Roman mausoleum. It was built by Constantine's own daughter, Constanza. This is where she was buried, in this big sarcophagus here. The story goes that when Constanza was a little girl, she contracted leprosy. So she prayed to Saint Agnes, and Agnes saved her. That was the power that martyrs had. Their miracles could change history. And that's why Constanza wanted to be buried here, as close to Saint Agnes as she could be. These Roman mausoleums, as you can see, were a completely different shape from the basilicas. Mausoleums were round. They weren't places for the crowd to charge up and down. These were places of burial and contemplation, sacred spaces that enfold you. And these round Roman mausoleums were to have a profound effect on the Christian church. See this famous book? It's The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire by Edward Gibbon. The history of Rome in 12 mighty volumes. So this is the Roman Empire at the time of Constantine. Now, according to Gibbon here, Rome collapsed because the Romans grew decadent and soft. But I think you can see from this map here what the real problem was. The empire was just too big. This way, it went all the way to Scotland up here, and the other way, deep into the Middle East. There was just too much empire to govern efficiently. And when Constantine came along, he made the momentous decision to divide the empire in two, with a Western Empire over here and an Eastern Empire over there. To govern this new Eastern Empire, which came to be called Byzantium, Constantine founded a new Christian capital on the Bosphorus. A grand ruling city designed from scratch, which he named after himself, Constantinople. Though these days we call it Istanbul. Here in the western half of the empire, Rome was no longer cut out to be the capital either. It was living on former glories, a pretty collection of ruins. The empire needed somewhere more vigorous to be ruled from, somewhere better placed. Somewhere near the sea, perhaps, with good connections to the east. Somewhere about here. Ravenna. The mosaic lovers among you will know Ravenna already. You'll know that it's mosaic heaven, where the Christian mosaic excelled itself. How could anyone ever have thought any of this constituted a dark age? This is the church of San Vitale. It's one of a group of churches in Ravenna that's filled with these stunning mosaics. But the reason I brought you to this particular church is because of its shape. As you can see, it's round, like a mausoleum, and not long and thin, like a basilica. These round churches of early Christianity have a particular effect on the visitor. They offer a 360-degree experience, a sense of enclosure and centering. The early Christians used round architecture, particularly for churches devoted to the martyrs, like San Vitale up there, who'd stood up to Diocletian and died for his faith. The basilicas were action spaces where you met and assembled and paraded. But these round churches, these are thinking spaces. They're like a protective bell jar dropped onto an important location, protecting it and sanctifying it. You still get a sense here of a transcendental space built around a precious relic, and that mysterious, magical effect of an interior sculpted from light. And it wasn't just the burial sites of the martyrs that had special power. Bits of their bodies had it too. Their hair, their bones. And to house these precious relics, the Christians began to create marvellous jewelled containers, relic boxes made from the finest materials with astonishing delicacy and beauty. Because these relics had the power too, every Christian altar had to have a relic inside it to validate it and make it sacred. Relics were like pieces of portable magic that could be transported from church to church. And wherever they were placed, they made that space holy. So by the time we get to this glorious Byzantine cathedral of Monreale in Sicily, all the ingredients of Christian worship are in place. Just look at it. By the time Monreale was finished, the Dark Ages were over. But all this was shaped by Dark Age achievements. At this end, the nave, it's like a basilica, long and thin, a space for assemblies and parades. At this end of the church, the east end, where the main altar is filled with precious relics, the magisterial apse has grown huge and enveloping. So at this end, this is like a round church, a special place filled with light and a golden, magical air. But over here, it's like a basilica, a space for assemblies and processions. So up there, a thinking space, and down here, an action space. All brought together in one magnificent piece of architecture. High up on the walls, scenes from Christ's miracles. There he is again, raising Lazarus from the dead. And over there, he's curing the paraplegic, making him walk again. And look what's above the altar. The Virgin and Child, borrowed from the Egyptian Isis. And on either side of her, two angels borrowed from pagan victories. And above that, trumping them all in size and magnificence, sitting so proudly in his golden apse, an enormous Byzantine Jesus, Zeus-like and bearded, unmistakably divine. This is a proper divinity, a Byzantine ruler god you can look up to, magnificent, all-powerful. And look also on either side of Jesus, you can see his name spelled out in Greek letters. On the left, Iota and Sigma, J and S, the first and last letters of Jesus. And on the right, Chi and Sigma, C and S, the first and last letters of Christus. It's that Christian word code again. Look at his fingers too. Christ, the ruler, is spelling out his own name with his hands. There's Iota and Sigma, J and S, for Jesus, and Chi and Sigma for Christ. My fingers are a bit too stubby for it, but he's doing it perfectly. It's that secret religious language again that Christianity had employed from the beginning. Even in this giant Jesus, larger than any Roman emperor, Christianity couldn't resist a final moment of mystery. The word barbarian is a misleading expression, and the art that goes with it is misleading too. This picture was painted in 1890 by an arrogant French painter called Joseph Noël Sylvestre. It shows the sack of Rome in 410 AD by the Visigoths. The Visigoths were a so-called barbarian tribe. You can't miss them. They're the ones without any clothes on. It's such nonsense. The Visigoths were never naked savages clambering about Rome, destroying civilization. They were pioneering Europeans who produced beautiful art and who achieved important things. It was actually these so-called barbarians who invented trousers. Riding a horse was much easier in trousers. So if it wasn't for the barbarians, we'd all be wearing togas. So this is a film about misunderstood peoples and their misunderstood achievements. About how we've got the Dark Ages wrong again. And about a word whose meaning has been warped by time. It's this word here, barbarian. The Dark Ages go roughly from the 4th century to roughly the 11th. And I've been looking at the art made in these years, trying to convince you that it wasn't dark at all. In this film, I'll be leaping to the defence of the so-called barbarians. The word barbarian actually comes from the ancient Greek. Its original meaning was someone whose language you can't understand, a foreigner. You know, like we say, it all sounds like Greek to me when we can't understand something. Well, the Greeks said, it all sounds like ba, ba, ba. So it was an onomatopoeic word. Anyone who spoke a funny foreign language was a barbarian. The same word, barbara, can be found in Sanskrit, the ancient language of India, where it means gibberish or stammering. And if you're actually called Barbara, like Barbara Windsor or Barbara Streisand, then I'm afraid your name means barbarian woman. And you, madame, are particularly in touch with your barbarian self. When the Romans took over the word, it came to mean anybody, anywhere who wasn't a Roman. So, the Persians were barbarians, the Indians, the Chinese, the entire non-Roman world. It isn't just this word barbarian that's been demonized and distorted. If you open your dictionary and start looking for words with bad Dark Ages connotations, you'll find lots of them. Take this word here, vandal. The Vandals were actually another fascinating and creative ancient peoples who made things like this. But their name's been stolen from them and turned into something dark. Or what about the Goths? Today, Goths are oily punks with dyed black hair who worship the devil. But in real life, in Roman times, the Goths were fabulous international creatives who made the most beautiful Bible I've ever seen. But the worst of these so-called barbarians, these forgotten ancient peoples whose reputation has been trashed by the Romans, the very worst of them were the Huns. Poor Huns. If anyone in ancient history deserves some rebranding, it's this notorious nation of energetic invaders. No one had a good word to say about them. The Goth historian Jordanus tells us they were scarcely human, a stunted, puny and faithless tribe. Christian writers were even harsher. According to a Christian cleric writing in Syria, the Huns eat the flesh of children and drink the blood of women. It's like reading a bad airport paperback. The Christians were determined to demonize all pagans, and they were particularly determined to demonize the Huns. So we can't trust the Christian clerics. We need to trust the art. And that tells a different story. In the First World War, the British began calling the Germans Huns. It was the worst insult they could think of, but also very bad geography, because the Huns were not from Germany. Exactly where they came from is one of the big mysteries of the Dark Ages. Nobody knows for sure. But it was somewhere out here in the Eurasian steppe, somewhere far away and different. The first record of the Huns in Europe dates from around 376 AD, when a group of retreating Goths turned up here on the banks of the Danube and begged the Romans to take them in. The fleeing Goths had been pushed out of their lands by a nation of nomads coming in from the east. A fighting tribe of whom everyone was scared. Huns were fierce warriors, there's no denying that, but not all the time. Like all nomads, they lived a precarious travelling existence and moved around in small family groups of menfolk, women and goats. The default lifestyle of the Huns was a tinkerish domesticity. And among the splendid Hunnic objects they've left behind, the defining ones are these battered Hunnic cauldrons, preserved in the museum in Budapest. In these robust vessels, the Huns cooked their goats and boiled their water. A man can live to 50 is an old Kazakh saying that still circulates, but a cauldron will live to 100. Something else we know about the Huns is that they loved gold. Oh, how the Huns loved gold. The Hunnic graves that have been dug up, the buried caches of treasure and valuables, reveal such a deep and instinctive passion for treasure. These days, we've lost sight of gold's crazy, hypnotic power, and that special relationship it enjoys with the sun. The Incas called it the sweat of the gods. And in the Dark Ages, gold was a substance with a magical presence. And the Huns loved it in a visceral and unbalanced way. In my book, that's a good reason to love them back. because they spent so much of their life on the move, travelling from pasture to pasture, the Huns had a particularly creative relationship with the natural world. Hun treasure is dominated by exquisite animal forms. In the Hermitage Museum in St. Petersburg, there's a wonderful piece of jewellery. It's a golden bit of a bangle or a neck torque, like one of these. And it's this piece here at the end, shaped so atmospherically, like the head of a creeping wolf. This is gold that nurses an intense symbolic ambition to commune with the natural world, to speak to it and steal some of its power, to steal the power of the wolf. Another animal that was dear to them was the eagle. They probably used eagles to hunt with, as nomads of the steppe still do. And the great bird in the sky inspired such beautiful Hun bling. Eagles have a special significance for the Hun. They were ready-made symbols of power and beauty combined. And right across the barbarian world, these garnet-studded eagle brooches became noticeably popular. This powerful new relationship to the natural world was one of the great barbarian contributions to civilization. And then, of course, there was the magnificent Hunnic horse art. The Hun depended on their horses totally, and they loved them deeply. So, of course, they made sure their horses looked suitably splendid too. These are the remains of a full-length Hunnic horse ornament, fashioned delicately from gold and studded so generously with precious stones. Lucky is the horse who got to wear this. The Huns would ride into battle with wolf skins pulled down on their faces, screaming demonically in a deliberate effort to get inside their enemies' heads. Now this was dark psychological warfare, very sophisticated. And one of the reasons the Huns were so easy to demonize is because they looked so strange. They practiced ritual deformation, and their skulls were deliberately misshapen at birth. Infant Huns would have their heads tightly bound, so they grew into these uncanny and elongated Mekon shapes. And on these deformed heads of theirs, the Huns would balance spectacular crowns of unimaginable preciousness. So the big question is, where did the Huns get their gold? They were nomads, not miners. And although they were busy tradesmen, you'd need to trade an awful lot of goat skins for the amount of gold left behind by the Huns. They didn't trade for it. The Huns got their gold more directly, straight from the Romans. Because their bows were so lethal and their horsemen so skilled, the Huns were soon operating a protection racket across most of the Roman Empire. What they'd do is invade somewhere, or threaten to invade somewhere, and then demand large quantities of gold to go away again. The Romans, cowardly diplomats that they were, preferred to pay them than to fight them. And by the time the Hunnic Empire was at its largest extent, the Huns were receiving 2,500 pounds of gold coins from the Romans every year. 2,500 pounds of gold every year to melt down and turn into art. A few tribes of nomads raiding along these Roman borders could never have pressurised the Romans into giving up these enormous quantities of gold. So we need to forget this image of the Huns as a tribal horde sweeping across Europe, because they were something much more sophisticated than that. This is a map of the Hanukk Empire under Attila. It's the bits in orange. And just look at the size of it. All this was Hanukk. This wasn't a bunch of nomads on the make. This was a rival empire, a new superpower of the Dark Ages, turned up to take on the Romans. I've kept Attila back, because the moment you mention him, the story of the Huns takes on a satanic glint. All the Huns were demonised by history, but Attila was demonised most of all. The exciting thing is we actually know a lot about him. A Roman diplomat called Priscus was sent on one of these diplomatic missions to negotiate with the Huns, and he's left behind a vivid account of his journey. And this gentleman here is building a replica of Attila's palace on the actual site on which he thinks it actually stood. So Janos, when did you first become interested in Attila?
I bought this land 20 years ago to breed horses. That was when we came across the history of this site. Priscus, the Byzantine ambassador, visited Attila in 450 AD and describes how he found his way here. And he definitely identified this place as the site of Attila's palace. That's why we'd like to erect a memorial to him here by constructing a wooden palace.
Janos's palace will be created in timber, exactly as Priscus describes. It's shaped like a giant nomad's tent, a kind of glorified yurt with two wooden towers rising cockily at the front. Priscus tells us that when he arrived, he was treated to an enormous banquet served on silver plates. And a procession of young women dressed in white veils came out to sing for him. Attila himself was simply dressed and ate nothing but meat on a wooden platter, while the guests were given goblets of gold and silver. What does Attila mean to the Hungarian people? Because for a lot of people in Europe, he has a very bad reputation, but not here. In Hungary, he seems to be thought of more as a hero.
When people say Attila was a barbarian, that's something I reject. It's not something I believe. He spoke 8 languages by the age of 15 and laid Europe at his feet. Someone unintelligent, a barbarian, could not have done the things that Attila did. Only someone blessed with special talents.
Did Attila's palace really look like this? I very much doubt it. But neither do I think Janos's fantasy is more misleading than all the other Hun fantasies about satanic hordes sweeping through Europe. By the time Attila became their ruler, the Huns had created a complex political system. Their huge empire was actually a federation of many nations, a kind of
barbarian EU opposed to the Romans, with Goths and Burgundians, Alans, even a few Greeks, all linked together and ruled by Attila. So here at the Kunsthistorische Museum in Vienna, there's something really spectacular I just have to show you.
When this was dug out of the ground on the Romanian border in 1799, it was thought to be Attila the Hun's personal dinner service. You can see why they thought that. Just look at how splendid this is. 23 golden vessels, nearly 10 kilos of pure gold.
Today, no one thinks this was Attila's dinner service. The most recent thinking is that it was left behind by the Avars, one of those mysterious tribes that emerged from the confederation of the Huns.
They obviously had that special relationship with nature too. This magnificent bull-headed bowl is another example of powerful natural magic channeled into gold. This is what the Dark Ages were capable of. This is what makes these times so exciting. That bull bowl has a power to it, an animal energy that you just don't get later on when art loses this connection to the basic stuff of life. The empire of the Huns didn't last long. For a few decades, it rivaled the Romans, and then it was gone.
Attila, the glue that held it all together, had a taste for young brides. And on his final wedding night, he drank himself into a stupor, took his latest bride to bed, and promptly died of a heart attack. They found him the next morning with blood streaming down his nose, what we'd call these days a rock star's death.
Within a few years, Attila's empire was gone, torn apart by feuds and incompetence. But the Huns had done their job. They'd punched a hole in the invincible reputation of the Romans. Now, all manner of barbarian was queuing up to pour through it. When we think of the barbarians, we think of hordes of bellicose warriors storming across the plains to attack Rome. But that's wrong. It was more of a migration. Think of those wagon trains rolling across the American West, full of brave pioneers searching for a new future. That's a more accurate image, particularly in the case of another great barbarian nation whose name has been well and truly blackened by Dark Age propaganda. The Vandals. Nay. According to my shorter Oxford dictionary, a Vandal is a willful or ignorant destroyer of anything beautiful, venerable, or worthy of preservation. That's what it meant in 1663, but it shouldn't be what it means today. The story of the Vandals is actually rather poignant. They were basically a nation of Germanic farmers living peacefully in Central Europe until the Huns pushed them out. For a while, they ended up here in Spain until a group of Goths pushed them out of there as well. And the poor old Vandals had to move on again to here, North Africa. In 429 AD, 80,000 people came across the Straits of Gibraltar, crammed onto small boats. A kingdom on the move, looking for a homeland. The Vandals had arrived in Africa. Originally, this word Vandal meant something like wanderer, someone who's looking for something. It comes from the same Germanic root as the English word to wend, as in I was wending my way home from work. And the Vandals were great wenders and great wanderers. The Vandals who arrived here in Africa were led by a formidable king called Gizeric. If you think of the Vandals as a lost people and Africa as the promised land, then Gizeric was their Moses, leading them across the oceans. They made their way along the North African coast here, attacking cities, collecting followers, absorbing territory, until eventually, in 439 AD, they reached their destination. Carthage. Carthage was the second largest city in the Western Roman Empire. Busy, rich, a crucial trading centre. The Romans depended on it for most of the olive oil they burned in their lamps, and the wheat from which they made their bread. When the Vandals took Carthage, they shocked the Roman Empire. The capture of Carthage was surprisingly peaceful. Gizeric was so clever. He entered the city on the 19th of October, the day of the Roman Games, Sports Day. Now, the Romans, who were obsessed with sports, were far too interested in the gladiatorial combat and the chariot racing to fight the Vandals. Thus Gizeric and his Vandal army strolled into the second largest city of the Western Roman Empire, took control of it, and stayed there for the next century. People used to think the Vandals went about destroying and pillaging Carthage as soon as they got here. But today, we know they didn't. The most remarkable thing about the Vandal occupation of Africa is not how much they destroyed, but how little. Later on, angry Romans and Christians writing about these events made sure they blackened the Vandals' reputation, as they did with all the barbarians. But the art that remains from these times tells a different story. To signal their new status as overlords of Rome's most prosperous province, the Vandals did what the nouveau riche always do. They spent money on the arts. Their jewellers were commanded to make gorgeous Vandal bling. And out in the countryside, they built elegant villas for themselves and filled them with superb decorations. That's the Julius Mosaic. It's one of the masterpieces of the period. And Julius himself is sitting there in his white robe, and he's the man who commissioned the mosaic. No one is 100% certain if this was made just before the Vandals got here or just after. And that's the most telling thing about it. This is how rich Romans lived, and also rich Vandals. Julius's house, where this was found, is shown in the middle, the posh fortified villa. Those domes at the back are the bath houses, the equivalent today of a luxury swimming pool.
All around the villa, there are busy scenes of rural life in North Africa. Up on the left, that's winter. See the people picking olives? That's what you did in winter. On the other side, on the right, is summer. See the shepherds with their summer flock and those fields of ripe wheat behind them. Down here are spring and autumn. Spring is the season of flowers, and there's Mrs. Julius in her garden, admiring herself in a mirror, while a servant brings her a bowl of roses. They're beautiful, and so is she. On the other side, it's autumn, and there's Lord Julius himself sitting on a throne in his orchard, while a labourer brings him a basket of grapes and a hare he's caught running about among the vines. This is mosaic making of the highest calibre, so imaginative and clever. It isn't just a portrait of Julius and his house. This is a visualization of the perfect lifestyle, a rural dream made real.
The message here is how glorious life is when man lives in harmony with nature, when order prevails and the land is fertile and balanced. Welcome to the good life in Africa. Instead of knocking down Carthage, the Vandals set about making it more homely. They put small houses in the huge Roman clearings. And, famously, an ambitious new bathhouse was built here by the art-loving Vandal king, Thrasimund.
Bathhouses were hugely important in Roman society. They were a kind of social club where people went to chat and gossip. A bit like modern health clubs, except much cheaper.
Roman bathhouses had two main spaces. A hot room, or caldarium, that heated you up, and a cold room, or frigidarium, that cooled you down.
The largest of all Roman bath complexes was here in Carthage, the Antonine Baths, built in the 2nd century by the Roman Emperor Antoninus Pius. These are the ruins. So imagine how big the baths must have been.
Long before the Vandals conquered Carthage, the Antonine Baths had fallen into disrepair. So the Vandal king, Thrasimund, built some new ones. We know a lot about Thrasimund's baths because, amazingly, a collection of Vandal poems on the subject has survived.
That's right, Vandal poems. The Vandals were particularly keen on poetry, and hundreds of poems written here in Carthage in the Vandal years have survived. And this thick body of unexpected literature tells us so much about them.
A poet called Felix has left behind an evocative description of Thrasimund's bathhouse. This magnificent monument erected by royal command, where water and fire display their obedience.
There were no less than 5 poems by Felix about these great baths. And the big idea in all of them is this dramatic contrast between the cool, refreshing springs of the frigidarium and the hot, boiling waters of the caldarium.
Here, says Felix, icy spring waters exist harmoniously with flames. Here, the shivering nymph is startled by the fiery bath.
Felix's poems were actually displayed all around you as you bathed, as mosaics. So they surrounded you, pushed their way into your thoughts. And as you read them, you were prompted to marvel at this great miracle achieved here by Thrasamund.
In the Vandal baths, Thrasamund has achieved the ultimate harmony. Thrasamund has united fire and water.
Goth. Oh yeah, Gothic. Barbarous, rude, uncouth. Gothic. Ah, here we are. Goth, one of a Germanic tribe who invaded the Roman Empire.
In the lexicon of hate spawned by the Dark Ages, a special place is set aside for the Goths. The Dark Ages are full of nasties, but the Goths are particularly spooky.
If you walk down the street where I live in London, in Camden Town, you'll find plenty of modern Goths wandering about. They're dressed from head to toe in black and covered in satanic insignia. And they're trying so hard to look doomy. And I just want to give them all a big hug and tell them to cheer up. Because if they want to be Goths, they should be like real Goths. Energetic, colourful, inventive. The kind of people who did that. Stunning, isn't it? I love the way the mosaic sparkles with all that gold and throws light all round the dome. It's so exciting.
But there's something peculiar about it too, something slightly awkward. That's obviously Jesus up there, being baptized, but why is he so pink and flaccid and not very divine? How did Jesus end up like this? Originally, the Goths came from up here, the Baltic coast.
They were farmers, successful farmers. But when their population exploded, they made their way south to the Black Sea, searching for better land and better farming conditions.
When the Goths moved south, they came into direct contact with the Roman Empire, and their history immediately grew more problematic.
It would take me several programmes to deal with all the twists and turns in the story of the Goths and their migrations. But to boil it down to its essentials, when they settled here in the south, they found themselves in the way of the Huns coming in from the east. So to get away from them, the Goths split in two. Now some of them fled across the Danube here and begged the Roman Empire to let them in. And they became the Visigoths, or Western Goths. And they settled initially here in France and finally in Spain. But the other ones, they stayed put over here and joined the Huns in the Hanukk Empire. And they became the Ostrogoths, or Eastern Goths. And they're the ones who did this.
When you think of barbarians, you think instinctively of pagans, don't you? Of godless and violent people with strange and primitive beliefs. Conan the Barbarian is hardly altar boy material, is he?
Actually, most of the barbarians were Christians.
even the Vandals. So were the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths. All of them were converted to Christianity in the 4th century. However, the form of Christianity they were converted to was unusual. The reason why this Christ looks so unfamiliar and even peculiar is because he's an Aryan Christ and not a Catholic one. And Aryan Christianity is different. Arianism was a Christian heresy, a different form of Christianity, proposed by a priest called Arius in Alexandria, in Egypt, in the 4th century. From there, it spread across the Roman Empire, and then out among the barbarians. The Aryans believed that Jesus was different from God. He was divine, yes, but less so. The Catholics believed that God and Jesus, Father and Son, were equal, two different forms of the same great divinity. But the Aryans disagreed. For them, God the Father was the one true God. He was the God at the top, and Jesus, his Son, was below him. And that's why the Jesus up here in the baptistry mosaic looks so wimpish. This is a Jesus who's more like the rest of us. Less divine, more human. Perhaps that's why the barbarians preferred him. He's less imperial and more like them. This is Ravenna in northern Italy, the capital of the Ostrogoths. Right across the empire, Catholics and Aryans distrusted each other, as only co-believers can. But in Ravenna, it was the Aryans who held sway. And it was Arianism that created this. It was a bit like the Sunnis and the Shia in Islam. Same religion, different only in its details, but so antagonistic towards each other. The Ostrogoths were led by a formidable Aryan king called Theodoric. And it was Theodoric who built this. Theodoric had been brought up in Constantinople in the court of the Eastern Roman Empire. He'd been sent there by his own father as a hostage and educated as a Roman. So he was sophisticated and clever. Having gained the trust of the Roman Emperor Zeno in Constantinople, Theodoric persuaded Zeno to let him come to Italy and reconquer it from another Germanic despot called Odoacer. Theodoric invited Odoacer to a banquet in his honour, and there he murdered him with his bare hands, or so they say, and thus Theodoric made himself ruler of all Italy, based here in Ravenna. Under the Ostrogoths, Ravenna thrived as never before. This is the great Basilica of San Apollinaire that Theodoric built early in the 6th century, and then filled with this spectacular parade of mosaics. Up on the ceiling, a baby-faced Aryan Christ performs such a lively set of miracles, raising Lazarus from the dead, conjuring up miraculous fish. So up there is the story of the young Jesus performing his miracles. And on the other side, over there, the other end of the story, Christ's terrible death and resurrection. The Last Supper.
the kiss of Judas. Below that, there's this great golden procession of the 22 virgins bearing sumptuous crowns, lined up to pay homage to the Virgin Mary, with Jesus in her lap. On the other side, in a kind of Aryan call and response, the 26 martyrs, dressed more simply in white and advancing in a mighty procession towards the enthroned Jesus.
What marvellous religious theatre this is. What vivid and exciting mosaics. And all you pretend Goths in Camden, if you're watching, the real Goths made this.
Unfortunately, later on, when the Roman Emperor Justinian reconquered Ravenna for the Byzantines, he set about tampering with what Theodoric had done, removing what he could of the Aryans. So see this portrait here? That's actually Theodoric, but Justinian has taken over his identity and he's pretending to be him.
This, they say, is what's left of Theodoric's Ravenna palace. You can see it inside San Apollinaire as well. A great golden palace, filled once with magnificent Ostrogoth treasures. There's a museum in Romania, in Bucharest, that's bursting with this Ostrogoth bling. And personally, I'd be happy to put on some shades and just stare at it for the next few days. But we can't, because back in Ravenna, the story of the Ostrogoths has darkened and grown eerie. When Justinian conquered Ravenna, he had all signs of Theodoric and the Ostrogoths removed. And the Great Mosaic Palace is now a ghost town with no one in it. Though if you look very carefully, you can still make out a few of the bodiless Ostrogoth hands that remain. Theodoric left his mark on many art forms. But the one that surprises me most is this totally unexpected piece of Dark Age literature.
The Silver Bible is a Gothic gospel book written in Gothic with a Gothic alphabet. It was written in northern Italy, probably in Ravenna, and probably for the Ostrogothic king Theodoric the Great. In the beginning of the 6th century.
Most people imagine that what used to be called the barbarian tribes, such as the Goths, didn't have a literature, but this, of course, is written in the Gothic language.
Yes, and that's very remarkable because we don't know anything about the other Germanic languages, but the Gothic languages is preserved in this manuscript.
It's very beautiful to look at. It's got these lovely purple pages with the silver writing on it.
Yes, it's the imperial color, the purple color. And Theodoric the Great, he got the permission from the East Roman Emperor to use this purple color. And he behaved and acted like a Roman emperor.
Theodoric, who lived to be over 70, deserves to be remembered as one of the great achievers of the Dark Ages. This is where he was buried, his mausoleum in Ravenna. And I can't think of another building anywhere that looks anything like this. What eerie and inventive architecture. I love this thing. It's so stocky and unusual. A unique example of Ostrogoth building, which seems to have popped out of nowhere. And that's just the outside. Wait till you see the inside. Theodoric died in 526 AD and was buried here in this huge sarcophagus, shaped like a Roman bath. I find this such a spooky space, and it's absolutely unique. That roof is made from a single piece of Istrian stone. It's 1 metre thick, 33 metres wide, and weighs 300 tons. To get it here from Istria, which is roughly where modern Croatia is, they had to load it onto an enormous raft and sail it across the Adriatic. Can you imagine? That cross up above, that's original too. And there used to be silver stars all around it. So when you looked up in here, it was like looking up at the sky at night. There are some exciting stories about Theodoric's death. Some say he went mad after seeing one of his victims inside the head of a fish. Others say he was thrown from a volcano. One thing's certain, the Ostrogoth Empire he created collapsed quickly after his death. Justinian reclaimed Ravenna. The Ostrogoth era was over. So that's the end of the Ostrogoths. But what about the Visigoths, or Western Goths? The Goths in Spain over here. What happened to them, you might be thinking? And what did they achieve? Well, rather a lot, as it happens. This is Palencia in Spain, and what you're looking at is the oldest surviving Spanish church, built in the 7th century by the Visigoths. The Visigoths ruled Spain from around 500 AD to around 700 AD. That's 200 years, but you hardly ever hear about them. You hear about the Romans in Spain, you hear about the Muslims in Spain, but you don't hear about the Visigoths. One cruel wag has christened them the Invisigoths, which is very unfair. If you hunt around in Spain, you'll find plenty of evidence of Visigoth achievement, like this rustic annunciation carved into an emerald. And sometimes you don't have to look hard at all to see the Visigoths showing off their Dark Age skills. Like these superb Visigoth crowns, with the name of the king who commissioned them spelled out helpfully for the hard of remembering. Aren't they magnificent? Those Visigoth crowns are not for wearing on your head. They're what's called votive crowns, and they are for hanging above an altar in a church. Like the Ostrogoths, the Visigoths were originally Aryans. But here in Spain, they were surrounded by Roman Catholics and quickly adopted the Romanic version of Christianity. And that's when they built these exciting and inventive Visigoth churches.
This is the church of St. John the Baptist in Palencia. It's been remodelled here and there, but most of what you see is Visigoth. The story goes that the Visigoth king Recesvinto built this church to thank God for curing him of liver disease. He washed himself just out here in the holy waters of Palencia and was suddenly cured.
Recesvinto was on his way north to fight the Basques, so he was particularly grateful for his miraculous cure, and even put up a plaque with the date the church was finished, January the 3rd, 661 AD. Recesvinto's plaque is surrounded by typically vigorous bits of Visigoth decoration, so energetic and busy. Completely unlike anything the Romans came up with.
I really like this Visigoth church decoration. When I look at it, I feel as if I can hear the sculptor whistling. There's something so boisterous about it, something real and untutored. It's as if for the first time in art, we're hearing from the common man.
This wasn't made by an artiste. This was made by a bloke. Someone with big hands who's speaking to us across the ages.
The sheer inventiveness of these Visigoths is so invigorating. I mean, look at these arches. They're special, right? Why are they special? Because they look like one of these.
I don't know how much you know about arches, but if you're any sort of student at all, you'll know that horseshoe arches are remarkable. Your bog standard arch certainly wasn't shaped like this.
Before the Visigoths invented these, arches were semicircular. They came round like that and that's it. But these horseshoe arches, they come down to here and they have a very different effect.
Horseshoe arches look wider, airier, taller, more elegant, as if a sail has been unfurled and filled with wind. They're more playful too, less stern. This is architecture doing more than has been asked of it. This isn't just holding something up. This is having fun and looking good.
So the Visigoths invented these elegant horseshoe arches. And these were a brilliant barbarian invention. But although the Visigoths invented them, they didn't perfect them. It was someone else who did that.
The perfecters of the horseshoe arch are the subject of the next film, when we look at the art of Islam. In the hands of Islamic artists, the horseshoe arch would create architecture of spine-tingling beauty. It's yet another of the great achievements of the Dark Ages. This is a series about the Dark Ages, when civilization was said to have stopped and ignorance flooded the world. I've been trying to convince you that it didn't happen, that the Dark Ages were a fine era for art. But in this film, I'm going further. The art we'll be looking at in this film is some of the most sophisticated ever made. If any art challenges the myth of the Dark Ages, it's the art of Islam. This is Cordoba in Spain. That's the great mosque of Cordoba up there. And this handy little Dark Age gadget is an astrolabe. Some people call this the first computer. And what this thing does is calculate exactly where you are by using the stars. Islamic stargazers perfected the astrolabe in the Dark Ages to work out the direction of Mecca. So they always knew which way to pray, and it filled their art with cosmic patterns. Later on, I'll be showing you how to use one of these, I hope. But first, we need to travel back in time to the beginnings of Islam, to the first fascinating creations of Islamic art and architecture. So right now, we're here in Cordoba, in Spain. But to go back to the beginnings of Islamic art, we need to go right across the Mediterranean to here. Jerusalem, the heart of the religious Dark Ages. What huge dramas have been enacted here? What important art has been created? Most of it's gone, unfortunately, but not all of it. Some of it has survived. Notably, that magnificent golden dome on the horizon, the Dome of the Rock. It's one of the most significant buildings ever put up, a piece of architecture that changed history. You couldn't really ask for a more dramatic location, could you? And if you think it looks good from up here on the Mount of Olives, just wait till we get closer. Muhammad died in 632 AD, and for the first 50 years or so after his death, Islam was preoccupied with conquest. The speed at which the Islamic Empire expanded was remarkable. In just a few decades, it went from nothing to gigantic. It was the most dramatic, most aggressive, and fastest feat of empire building the world has seen. This is the Islamic Empire just 100 years after Muhammad's death. Up here, the whole of Spain, all of North Africa, the entire Middle East, as far across as the borders of India. But all this astonishingly successful conquest didn't leave much time for art. Almost nothing survives from the first years of Islam. Clearly, art wasn't a priority. And then, out of nothing, as if by magic, this appears. The Dome of the Rock. Nothing in Islamic art prepares us for this. It's just suddenly there. A definitive Islamic creation seemingly conjured out of thin air. It's like a flying saucer or something that's landed out of nowhere. And something you sense immediately, even from this distance, is the powerful geometry of it. That air of mathematical clarity. And that's something that continues in Islamic architecture. As you can see, it's an octagon. It's got 8 sides. And octagons have a special symbolic presence because they combine the geometry of a circle with the geometry of a square. I'll show you. If I draw a circle here, and then 2 intersecting squares here and here, the shape they form, the shape in the middle, the octagon. The octagon is a surprisingly popular Dark Age shape, with powerful sacred meanings. If the earth is a square and heaven is a perfect circle, the octagon is a symbolic bridge between the two. All the proportions of the Dome of the Rock are meaningful. So these walls here, the walls of the octagon, each of those is about 20 meters long. And the dome in the middle, the height of that is again about 20 meters, and the diameter of it is also 20 meters. So all these proportions have been carefully calculated and have a purpose. It's as if the entire building has been shaped by a divine mathematics. And those divine mathematics have given it a sacred meaning. This location, Temple Mount, is the holiest spot in Jerusalem. This is where King Solomon built the first Jewish temple, the one destroyed by Nebuchadnezzar. And then Herod, the infamous King Herod, built the second temple here as well. Herod's temple was made entirely from white marble and was so huge it covered 67 acres of this sacred location. So grand, so pompous, and to my eyes, so inelegant. So the Dome of the Rock sits on layer upon layer of crucial religious history. And when the Muslims conquered Jerusalem in 638 AD and claimed this site for Islam, they took possession of what is probably the most loaded religious spot on earth. And that's just the outside. For me, this mysterious interior is one of the most atmospheric achievements of the Dark Ages. There's something so haunting about the way the light works in here. The shimmer of the mosaics, the whispers of the calligraphy. Basically, it's a circular shrine. It's not a mosque, it's a place of pilgrimage that's been built around a sacred site. And the site it's all been built around is the site of this holy rock here. The Jews believe this is the rock on which Abraham prepared to sacrifice his son, Isaac. And the Ark of the Covenant is thought to lie hidden somewhere underneath as well. Islam has a different tradition. Islam believes that this is the holy rock from which the Prophet Muhammad set off on his great night journey to heaven. The angel Gabriel came to visit Muhammad in Mecca and brought him here to Jerusalem. And from this rock, the Prophet ascended to heaven. And there, in paradise, he met God. And God instructed him on the Muslim duty of prayer. So this holy rock, like the architecture around it, is a point of contact between man and God. And that's the religious message of the whole building. If you saw the first film in this series, you'll recognise this shape, because we've seen it before. This type of encircling architecture built over a precious site is something we found in the round churches of Byzantium. Remember San Vitale in Ravenna and Santa Constanza in Rome. The Muslim Caliph Abd al-Malik, who built the Dome of the Rock, was deliberately taking on the architecture of the Christians. This round shape, the proportions, none of it is an accident.
Abd al-Malik also added an explicit inscription which runs all the way round and which gives the date in which the dome was finished, 691 AD. And it also includes a stern message to the Christians.
"O you people of the book," it says, meaning the Bible, "Jesus is only a messenger of God. God is only one God."
It's a deliberate challenge to the Christians. Jesus is just a prophet. There's only one God, and gods don't have sons. This entire building is taking on Christianity. Look at that. From floor to ceiling, it's covered in the most exquisite mosaics. Gold and green. There's a palm tree and these beautiful jeweled crowns. And all the pieces of the mosaic are set at different angles, so they reflect the light differently at different times of day. And all these glorious mosaics are intended to evoke a vision of paradise.
When you look there in paradise, says the Quran, you will see delights that cannot be imagined. Fruits of every kind and all that you ask for. At a stroke, Islam had invented for itself an unmistakable new architecture. And at the centre of this new architecture was a vision of paradise. The Islamic Paradise is a green and verdant alternative to the harsh desert landscape in which Islam was born. These are lands where water is precious, and so is hope. Just a few years after the Dome of the Rock was finished, the Umayyad caliphs in Damascus gave the world another wonderful Islamic structure. The Damascus Mosque. I think it's one of the most exciting buildings I've ever been in. And look what's on the walls. Inside the fabulous Damascus Mosque, the Umayyad caliphs set out actually to describe paradise and to surround the Islamic pilgrim with delightful and irresistible visions of it. It's one of Islam's most dramatic artistic moments. These are the joys that await us in heaven. These are the beautiful cities in which we'll live. And this is the water, the cool and endless water that we will drink.
Those magnificent images of paradise in the great mosque at Damascus are like images of a wonderful oasis in the desert with water, palm trees, flowers, everything that's so hard to find out here. And the Islamic paradise promises so many pleasures in the next life to the true believer. All you can drink, all you can eat, and all you can dream of.
This is Qasr Amra. It's one of the desert palaces which the Umayyad rulers of Damascus built out here to get away from the city. Its heat and its pressures. No one's certain which of the Umayyad princes chose this distant desert location. Was it the Caliph Al-Walid I or Al-Walid II? What is sure is why they chose this particular spot.
Qasr Amra is built in a wadi, the Wadi al-Batum, and wadis are desert valleys that fill up seasonally with water. So when it rains in the desert, the precious water floods through the wadi and fertilizes it.
Round the back of the building, over here, are various contraptions for channeling this water through the palace. Because, believe it or not, what you have before you here is a bathhouse. Qasr Amra is a bathing establishment in the desert. One of the earliest surviving secular buildings of Islam. The reason we've driven all this way across the desert to find it is because this fabulous bathhouse in the sands has something remarkable inside it. Something you'd never expect to find here. Floor to ceiling Islamic frescoes. A troupe of acrobats gives a busy performance. And there's a bear strumming a lute. There's so much going on in here. And a group of statuesque female dancers show off their figures and their beauty. The dancing girls are particularly surprising. We're just not used to Islamic imagery as abandoned as this. But it's important to remember that this is just as old and just as traditional as everything else we've seen. This too is a precious Islamic heritage. A negative way to understand Qasr Amra's remarkable frescoes is to see them as signs of moral relaxation. Away from Damascus, deep in the desert, a wayward Umayyad prince is indulging an appetite for wine and music and women. But I don't think that is what it's about. If we go back to the many descriptions of paradise in the Quran, there are constant references to the pleasures available there. Rivers of wine served in crystal cups, beautiful flowers, beautiful jewels, and beautiful girls. For the righteous, says the Quran, there shall be gardens and vineyards and high-bosomed virgins for companions, dark-eyed and bashful, as fair as corals and rubies. Inside here is the Caldarium, the hot room, and in here the Umayyad prince would soak himself in hot water, heated up by all those gubbins we saw outside. And as he lay here in his bath, the Umayyad prince would stare up at the dome, where he'd see something wondrous, an evocation of the stars at night. This is the earliest known Islamic star chart, painted onto the dome at Qasr Amra. Around the edge are the 12 signs of the zodiac. And in the middle, frescoed representations of the constellations. The Great Bear, the Little Bear. What a thing to find in an 8th century bathhouse, a fabulous image of the heavens at night above your head. It's as if someone's taken the roof off the dome and looked out into the sky at night in the desert full of twinkling stars. What a beautiful idea. It takes a bit of getting to Qasr Amra, but I wanted to make it clear right from the start that Islamic art, from its beginnings in the Dark Ages, has this sensuous dimension to it, a relationship to pleasure that you just don't find in other art. Scattered across this great Syrian desert are the remains of fantastical Umayyad palaces, filled once with beautiful mosaics and marvellous colonnades. What tangible sensuousness you find here, in this first Islamic art.
These 8th century desert palaces must once have been filled with the accoutrements of pleasure, vases, hangings, plates and cups, almost all of which have disappeared.
But in 1986, here in Jordan, they dug up this. It's an 8th century Islamic brazier, and it gives us a tiny hint of what life was like in the Kaziramra bathhouse. The brazier was used to heat up the prince's room and for burning incense. Originally, there were wheels on it, and it could be wheeled around from room to room to fill them with sweet smells.
It's made of iron and bronze, and at the front here, as you can see, there are these arches, a little bit like the ones in Kaziramra, and inside the arches are scenes of lovemaking and couples canoodling. And it's all so atmospheric and so beautifully done. I mean, look at these eagles at the bottom, the way they've been shaped, their wings, their feathers. This is metalwork of the highest quality.
At the four corners, 4 cuddly nudes prepare to release a small bird into the incense-filled air above them. And there's a floaty feeling to this marvellous metalwork.
What a beautiful thing. And the figurative sculptures you see here, the female figures, are again very surprising, because this is an aspect of Islamic art that was there at the start, that it's very traditional, but which modern Islam often forgets.
The beautiful brazier was an object of private delectation. It had no religious purpose. But it's important to remember that sensuality played a role in the art of these times. In the beginning, this was Islamic art too, and this, and this. When joy was called for, Islamic art inspired great joy. And when sobriety was more appropriate, it achieved great sobriety. This is the finest early mosque in Cairo, the Mosque of Ibn Tulun. I like everything about it, but most of all, I admire its architectural seriousness. The way you know, as soon as you step in here, that this is a space devoted to important understandings. Ahmed ibn Tulun, who founded this mosque in 879 AD, was the son of a Turkish slave who became governor of Egypt. Originally, the mosque stood at the centre of a new city that Ibn Tulun also founded, the city of Al-Khatai. But Al-Khatai was destroyed in the 10th century, and this is all that's left of it. They say Ibn Tulun chose this site because this is where Noah's Ark came to rest. There was certainly water here. That domed creation in the centre is the Ablutions Fountain, where all Muslims must wash themselves before prayers. All mosques, and not just this one, are based on the very first mosque, which was the Prophet's own house in Medina. It was a typical mud brick dwelling with a courtyard, and in that courtyard, the Prophet's followers would gather to hear him speak. So all these great courtyards of Islam, all of them, are descended directly from the Prophet's own courtyard. Their evocative sparseness is an echo of their origins, and their sun-baked simplicity has been there from the start. The walls that encircle you here are like the walls of the Prophet's own courtyard. Their task is to keep the outside world at bay. And here at Ibn Tulun, there's actually 2 sets of walls, a kind of double glazing that separates you from the hustle and bustle out there. I like these playful crenellations arranged along the top as well. They look like paper cutouts, something my daughter might have made. To protect his followers from the sun, the prophet built a simple shelter at the end of his courtyard with a roof made out of palm branches and leaves. And that simple shelter was the inspiration for these great arcades, which still protect the prophet's followers from the sun. The shelters in his courtyard were also used as somewhere to meet and discuss community affairs. And that marvellous communal atmosphere of a space with many purposes is something else that survives to this day in the Islamic Mosque. The largest covered space was the prayer hall, which was basically the prophet's own house at the end of the courtyard. And in every prayer hall today, there's a continuation of this marvellous Islamic sense that underneath all this mighty religious architecture, you can still feel the humble presence of the prophet's own dwelling. These prayer halls are so welcoming. They have a sense of the living room about them, a home from home. Most mosques are square or rectangular in plan, and that's because they're all arranged in relation to this wall here, which is called the Qibla Wall. The Qibla Wall indicates the direction of Mecca. In Arabic, the word Qibla means direction, and in Muhammad's house, a simple spear stuck in the ground would mark the way to pray. The centre of the Qibla Wall is marked by the mihrab, which is always the most ornate part of the wall, usually a niche. And these niches were probably inspired by the culminating niches of Byzantine churches, Christian architecture. And to the right of the mihrab is the minbar, or pulpit, and this is based once again on the prophet's own house. They say that when Muhammad had gathered so many followers he could no longer be heard by everyone, he stepped up onto some blocks of wood, and those are the origins of the minbar. How fascinating that all the great mosques of Islam inherited their wonderful clarity, their simplicity, and their underlying sacred geometry from the humble house of the Prophet. Look at all that wonderful stucco work around the arches, all that repetition and variety. This is art used in a different way, not to illustrate something, but to create a visual rhythm. Christian churches are full of pictures that tell you stories. But there are no pictures in these great Islamic interiors. The decoration here communicates in other ways. There's a sense of endlessness to it. It develops in all directions. And it makes you feel part of something that's bigger than you. So there are no pictures. Instead, all the way round runs this Quranic inscription carved into wood. You know, I said this mosque was built on the site where Noah's Ark was said to have come to rest. Well, another story they tell here is that this Quranic inscription is carved on the actual wood from Noah's Ark. At the Mosque of Ibn Tulun, the Quranic inscription runs for 2 kilometers around the building. That's 1/15 of the entire Quran written up on these walls. This is the word of God in its most sacred and purest form. The power of the word is one of the great creative obsessions of the Dark Ages. And in the Metropolitan Museum in New York, the most beguiling of the first Korans, the so-called Blue Koran, turns the words of God into such glorious art.
Don't know if you remember the building of the Aswan Dam in the 1960s. It was rather controversial. The president of Egypt, President Nasser, joined up with the Russians to build a dam across the Nile, and various archaeological sites were lost forever or had to be moved to new locations, stone by stone. All sorts of ecological disasters were predicted for the dam, most of which haven't happened.
The conquest of water was another of Islam's great achievements in the Dark Ages. In Cairo, the Nile would overflow its banks every summer, and the agriculture of the entire Nile Delta depended on the success of this fertile flooding.
Thick black silt, rich with nutrients, would be deposited across the floodplain, ensuring a splendid harvest. That was in the good years. In the bad years, the levels were either too low, which meant disaster, or too high, which also meant disaster. The Aswan Dam was built to control that process. So, you might wonder, what did they do before?
In Islamic times, they used this, the celebrated Nilometer of Rhode Island on the Nile. Opened for business in 861 AD, it's one of the oldest Islamic monuments in Egypt. And what dramatic evidence it offers of the aquatic brilliance of Islam's engineers.
What this thing does is measure the height of the Nile flood. It's basically a big well sunk some 10 meters under the level of the river. In the middle is an octagonal marble column, a kind of giant ruler, which, as you can see, is marked off at different heights. The measurements are in cubits, and 1 cubit is about half a meter. So around 16 cubits is the perfect flood, fertile, controllable. Below 16 cubits, there's not enough water, so famine conditions ahead. And higher up, once you get past 19 cubits, that's really bad, a catastrophic flood.
The Islamic authorities in Cairo used the Great Nilometer to calculate their annual tax demands. The perfect flood meant perfect profits ahead. Thus, this brilliant piece of design was an early Islamic alternative to the pocket calculator.
Before they built the Aswan Dam, these tunnels here led off into the Nile at 3 different levels. So if they weren't closed off now, I would be underwater. And look at those pointed arches above the tunnels. I mean, that's pure Gothic, 400 years early.
The Nilometer was designed by the famed Persian astronomer Abul Abbas Ahmed ibn Muhammad ibn Kathir al-Faghani, better known to us by his Latin name, Alfraganus.
Alfraganus's most famous achievement as an astronomer was calculating the diameter of the Earth. Copernicus was said to have used his results, and there's even a crater on the Moon named after him, the Alfraganus crater.
But it isn't just science that created this, and it isn't just commerce either. all the way round there are also these beautiful Quranic inscriptions in a lovely Kufic script. Thou seest the earth barren and lifeless, it says at the 17-cubit mark. But when we pour rain on it, it is stirred to life. At the Nilometer in Cairo, science, commerce and faith have combined in a uniquely Islamic fashion to create a technological wonder. This entire series is about how the Dark Ages weren't dark. But sometimes I should just shut up and let you see the proof for yourselves, because it couldn't be more obvious. This is Kairouan in Tunisia. Once this was a city of enormous power, the most important Islamic outpost in North Africa. Now, it's a marvellous place to visit for any true student of the Dark Ages. Kairouan, they say, was founded by the great Arab warrior Sidi Okba ibn Nafi, who conquered these parts for Islam just 50 years after the death of the Prophet. When Sidi Okba got here, this was all desert. But something made him pause and look down at his feet. When Sidi looked down, he saw a miraculous spring of fresh water bubbling up. And in that water, a golden cup, which he'd lost many years before at the holy spring in Mecca. The underground waters seemed to have carried it here, so it was clearly a sign. And on this holy spot, Sidi Okba founded Kairouan. At the centre of the new city, he built a new mosque, the oldest such mosque in North Africa. From the outside, there's not much sign of it. Islam isn't a religion that flaunts itself in the streets. But when you get inside, into the great courtyard of the Sidi Okba Mosque, what a powerful sight awaits you. Another practical use for these great mosque courtyards, particularly here in Kairouan where it's so dry, is for collecting water. When it rains, all the water is channeled down here to the centre. And see these decorative openings? They actually have a practical purpose. When the water flows through them, all these arabesques, they actually filter out the impurities, the dust, the feathers. And then the water, pure and clean, is saved below in 2 giant cisterns, so all of Kairouan can make use of it. Because it was built from nothing, Kairouan is a particularly pure Islamic city. There are few traces here of the Romans or the Vandals or the Byzantines. In Kairouan, Islam started from scratch. Except here in the courtyard of the mosque. Look at this column, look at the top. What is that, Corinthian? And next to it, I don't know, Phoenician? Over here, Roman perhaps? Could even be Egyptian, who knows? Of the 414 columns arranged around this great courtyard of the mosque in Kairouan, no 2 are the same. Every column is different. That's because they were all taken from other people's temples and palaces and city halls. This entire mosque was built from bits and pieces of other ancient buildings. In the old days, it was actually forbidden to count the columns in here. Anyone caught doing it was blinded. If you look closely, you find some really surprising things about this courtyard. For example, up here, there's a Christian cross. So this column must have come from a Byzantine church. But through some miracle of architectural power, despite all this busy borrowing, the end result
is an unmistakable sense of Islamic unity. This space could have come from nowhere else. This is unmistakably an Islamic space.
There are many remarkable things about the Karawan Mosque. But particularly remarkable, I think, is the proof that is offered here that architecture is an art form of spaces, not of details, of courtyards, not of capitals.
See the tower here? It's got these slabs of stone at the base with Latin inscriptions on them. See this one here? It's upside down. So these must have come from a Roman building. This is actually the oldest surviving Islamic minaret, and it's got a bulky, militaristic presence, rising up in these three squat pieces. But, like all minarets, its original purpose is glorious: to spread the word, to share the news, to shine a light.
The minaret is one of the defining Islamic achievements of the Dark Ages. Islam did much that was inventive and progressive in architecture, but in its minarets, it surpassed itself.
This word minaret comes from the Arabic manara, which means lighthouse, and that's its function, to be a beacon of hope, to offer safety and protection. And of course, the faithful were called to prayer from up there. In the very first mosque, built by Muhammad, the faithful were called from the rooftops. But as cities got bigger, mosques got bigger, you needed somewhere higher up from which to broadcast the faith.
And look what inventive shapes were found for this conquest of the sky. This is the minaret of the Great Mosque of Samarra in Iraq. Its nickname, for obvious reasons, is the snail shell. No one else in the Dark Ages built anything as aerially ambitious as this. And it wasn't just the mosques. This extraordinary brick masterpiece in Iran is the tomb of the Zirayad prince Qaboos ibn Vashimgir. It's 1,000 years old, but looks like something the Bower House might have come up with, don't you think? Inside, Qaboos had himself suspended at his death in a coffin of pure rock crystal. What a thrilling Islamic conquest of the heavens. Speaking of rock crystal, it's a very special substance, isn't it? According to the Quran, when the chosen arrive in paradise, they'll be given drinks of ginger, served in goblets of crystal.
Crystal, or rock crystal to be more specific, was a substance with which Islam seemed to have a special affinity. They say it was Ahmed ibn Tulun himself who introduced the art of carving rock crystals into Egypt. What's certain is that it was in Egypt that this difficult art reached perfection.
I don't know about you, but I can't think of many substances in the world with a presence as magical as rock crystal. Particularly when it has passed through the hands of the master carvers of Islam. Only a handful of these gorgeous Islamic ewers have survived, and that just makes them feel even more precious.
Rock crystal itself is actually very common. It's just a type of quartz, and quartz is the most common mineral in the Earth's crust. You get it everywhere. Look, there's a stripe of it here.
What isn't common is pieces of quartz so pure and perfect and transparent that they satisfied the demands of the great crystal carvers of Islam. No one has ever carved rock crystal more finely than this.
What they'd do is find a perfect lump of crystal and shape it on the outside, and then begin hollowing out the inside. And they'd hollow it further and further and further, till, in the very best Islamic art, the walls of the crystal were only a couple of millimetres thick. Now that was unbelievably difficult.
The shimmering images carved into these gorgeous crystal ewers would transport the drinker to paradise. Hunting scenes, flowers, beautiful birds, so crystal clear that none could resist them.
And it wasn't just Islam that saw something magical in this rock crystal. In Ireland, when Ireland was still pagan, they used to put pieces of rock crystal at the entrance of the burial chambers. And in Egypt, they carved it into perfect spheres, which apparently kept your hands cool when you touched it. And of course, it was used for telling the future. And it still is.
All sorts of Dark Age societies were fascinated by rock crystal. The Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder believed that rock crystal was actually frozen water, trapped for eons under the glaciers.
Even the early Christians worshipped it. For them, rock crystal had a natural relationship with divine perfection. So they put it on the outside of their reliquaries and up in their golden crosses, where its perfect presence seemed somehow to connect them to God.
Christian rock crystal has a different feel to it. In Christian hands, the light-filled paradise of Islam seemed to fill up with shadows. With Christian rock crystal, the Dark Ages are what you expect them to be. Mysterious, spooky, and talismanic. The water engineers of Islam perfected their hydraulic skills in lands where water was precious and rare. So their relationship to it had something of the dream about it. For Islam, water wasn't just a necessity, it was an enticement too.
This is Cordoba in Spain. The Muslim armies got here in 711 AD and conquered it from the Visigoths. Remember them from the last film. And when Islam arrived in Spain, it could not believe how fertile this new territory was, how full of paradisical waters.
This is the Guadalquivir in Andalusia, the largest navigable river in Spain. The name is Islamic. It comes from Al-Wadi al-Kabir, which means the Great Valley.
These days, the Guadalquivir River is only navigable up to Seville. But in Islamic times, you could sail all the way up here to Cordoba. And in this great city, Islamic water architecture surpassed itself.
All along the Guadalquivir, a cunning system of mills, dams and water wheels channeled the energy of the waters. The water wheels of Cordoba lifted water from the river high up to the bank, where the gardeners of Islam used it to recreate paradise on earth.
This isn't actually an Islamic garden. It's an Islamic style garden built by the Christian kings here in Cordoba Unfortunately, the original Islamic garden has disappeared. But Islam was here for 500 years. So this style of garden making is ingrained in the culture. And what you still get here is a vivid sense of how the Islamic garden felt. Fountains, waterways, flowers. These are the divine atmospheres of those magical paradisical mosaics we saw in the Great Mosque at Damascus. Except this time, they're real. To enter the mosque at Cordoba, you need to pass through another beautiful evocation of the paradise ahead. An orange grove, so divinely harmonious. This was obviously a very desirable location. They say there was a Visigoth church here originally, and later, when the Muslims were finally kicked out of Spain, a Catholic cathedral was plonked in the middle of the mosque, creating this ungainly hybrid. It was the Umayyad prince Abd al-Rahman I who began building the Cordoba Mosque. He actually bought the land from the Christians, and in those early days of religious tolerance, Muslims and Christians shared the building. The Cordoba Mosque is famous for its columns. 856 of them. Like rows of palm trees in the oasis of Syria is how someone's described them. Columns are very laborious to make, and they use up a lot of precious stone, so they're very heavy. And if you can avoid making them, you will. For the Cordoba Mosque, the columns came from the Visigoth Church that was there before, and also from nearby Roman temples. But these reused Visigoth columns weren't quite tall enough. So to make the Cordoba Mosque higher and more airy, the architects of Islam came up with a brilliant new idea: the double arch. 2 arches for the price of 1. At the bottom, the Horseshoe Arch, borrowed, as we saw in the last film, from the Visigoths. Then, on top of that, a round arch, arch number 2, making the mosque taller, less solid-looking, more see-through. For the first time in European architecture, the aesthetics of light were shaping a building. Do you know, Cordoba, when the Muslims were here, had 500,000 people living in it. It was by far the largest and most prosperous city in Western Europe. And all of those inhabitants had running water. They had toilets that flushed, street lamps. In the 10th century. In urban planning, architecture, mathematics, and water engineering, Islamic knowledge was peerless. And in one area, it was spectacular. Astronomy, the study of the stars. 90% of the 200 brightest stars in the sky have Arabic names. Vega, Betelgeuse, Algol, Deneb. They're all creations of the Dark Ages, because Arabic astronomy allowed the Dark Ages to glimpse the cosmos. Remember those stars painted onto the roof at the palace in Kaziramra? Well, that was just the beginning. While Christian science was insisting on a backward, biblical understanding of the cosmos, Islamic science was investigating the heavens more adventurously. This little baby here, the astrolabe, has been called the first computer,
It was developed to pinpoint the direction of Mecca. Muslims needed to pray 5 times a day in a specific direction at specific times. The astrolabe could work all that out in relation to the stars. So this was the first compass as well, and the first clock. So the way it works, the first thing you need to do is decide on which star you want to focus on. And I'm going to choose Vega. So I find Vega in the sky, and with these sights here, I line it up until I can see Vega in the middle. It's exactly there. And that gives me a reading here in degrees from the horizontal. So I can see that Vega right now is 35 degrees. So the next thing to do is to set the date, measured of course in the old-fashioned way, in phases of the zodiac. Right now we're in Gemini, so in fact we're in the 15th degree of Gemini, about there, otherwise known as the end of May. So this is basically that in diagrammatic form, and whatever is true on here is also true out there. So I know the date, I know where Vega is. So, with the help of this handy Dark Age sat-nav, I can finally work out where I am. It was Alfraganus, the multi-skilled designer of the nilometer in Cairo, who undertook the first great Islamic exploration of the stars. He was followed by many others. Without Islamic science and its sensuous delight in the cosmos, perhaps this really would have been a dark age. With Islamic science, it was anything but. In the next film, we'll be heading north to celebrate those fine craftsmen, the Vikings, and to investigate those particularly skilled jewellers of the Dark Ages, the Anglo-Saxons. So far, on this artistic journey through the Dark Ages, we've been hugging the Mediterranean and following the sun. But the Dark Ages wouldn't be as significant as they were in the story of art if they'd stayed in the south. To be properly influential, they needed also to venture north. This is Lindisfarne, high up on the north coast of Britain. Holy Island, they call it. And this monastery you see there was founded early in the 7th century by an Irish monk called Aidan. What a place to build a monastery, eh? Cut off from the mainland, beaten up by the sea. It's so out of the way and impractical. And that's precisely why it was chosen. The Irish monks who founded Lindisfarne weren't looking for an easy life. They were looking for difficulties to conquer. These were hardcore northern Christians who'd isolated themselves up here on purpose, who worked their fingers to the bone and created something out of nothing. As they saw it, Jesus had sacrificed his life for them. So the least they could do was sacrifice their comfort. The hardcore determination of the Lindisfarne monks shows not only in the miraculous building of their great monastery, but also in the stunning book art they made up here. So intricate, so detailed, so difficult. And that's the thing about the North's contribution to the art of the Dark Ages. What it achieved by going the extra mile, working the extra hour, adding
the extra detail. Nothing was given to it on a plate. In this film, we're going to be looking at the Carolingians, Dark Age expansionists from France, whose huge empire gobbled up most of modern Europe, but who made art of exquisite finesse and richness. Also, the Vikings, who despite their terrible reputation for raping and pillaging, were actually exceptionally inventive craftsmen. The extreme delicacy of Dark Age Viking art is an unexpected pleasure. Then up here, in the north of England, we'll be celebrating a Dark Age nation whose artistic handiwork was admired across the whole of Europe. I'm thinking, of course, of the Anglo-Saxons. So skilled, so hard-working, so ingenious. Speaking of hard work, one of the things we're going to be doing in this film is following the creation of an Anglo-Saxon jewel from start to finish. Later on, I'll introduce you properly to Sean Greenhalgh here. For now, all that really matters is that he's going to be making something exquisite. A silver disc brooch in the Anglo-Saxon manner.
Sean Greenhalgh's Anglo-Saxon brooch is a pleasure we're saving for later. First, we need to confront the North's most notorious barbarians. We've tackled some terrifying warrior nations in this series. The Huns, the Vandals, the Goths. But when it comes to bellicosity, no one has quite as fearsome a reputation as the Vikings.
You know, people get so much wrong about the Vikings. They didn't wear these ridiculous helmets for a start. These were invented in the 19th century by a stage designer working on a Wagner opera. He had to make one of the singing Vikings look particularly evil. So he stuck the devil's horns on a helmet. And the Vikings have been lumbered with these helmets ever since.
This is what their helmets really looked like. The only surviving Viking helmet in the National Museum in Oslo.
The Vikings were particularly interesting because while all the other Germanic tribes headed south and became thoroughly Italianate, the Vikings stayed in the harsh and windy north, where they clung to the old ways. So they were a barbarian nation of a pure and exciting type.
The Vikings were a living link to an older and deeper European past. There were forces at work in them that civilization hadn't dimmed. And that's what's so exciting about them.
In fact, most of the time they were simple farmers, tending the land, keeping livestock, growing what they could. But in the lands of the Vikings, you can't go very far without encountering water. And this constant presence of the sea had turned them into superb sailors. Exactly where they reached is still fiercely debated, but they certainly got to Greenland and then to Newfoundland. The Vikings discovered America a long, long time before Columbus. So, boatmanship was one of their great achievements, and another of their great achievements was art.
In the great years of Viking expansion, roughly 800 AD to roughly 1100 AD, the Vikings put almost as much energy into making their own art as they did into stealing other people's. This trefoil Viking brooch was modelled on the buckles used by Roman soldiers on their sword belts. The Vikings adapted it and turned it into a brooch for ladies. Much of what they made is so intricate and fine, it's difficult to see. So to make absolutely clear what adventurous creatives they were, I've brought you to Oslo, to one of the great Viking museums, where I wanted to show you this whopping great nautical masterpiece.
On the 8th of August 1903, a Norwegian farmer called Knut Rom knocked on the door of Professor Gabriel Gustafsson of the Museum of Antiquities here in Oslo. While digging on his farm, said Knut Rom, he'd come across a buried ship, and he thought it might be Viking. 2 days later, Professor Gustafsson arrived at the farm and confirmed the discovery of this thing, the Ulcerberg Ship.
Will you look at that, eh? It's made entirely of oak, over 60 feet long, 15 feet wide, and decorated at both ends with these boisterous Viking carvings.
Inside the ship were 2 dead bodies, an older woman who may have been a queen, and a younger woman, probably her slave, who was buried with her. There were also 14 horses, 3 dogs and an ox, all sacrificed together and buried with their master.
In the stern of the boat was a 4-wheeled cart, the first such Viking cart ever discovered. But no one seemed too sure what the weather was going to be like in heaven, because there were also 4 sledges.
But it's the carving of these boats and carts and sledges that makes this particular Viking find so exciting. Look at the elegant line of this ship, how it ends so gracefully up there with the curved head of the snake.
At either end, above the waterline where they can be seen, are these busy expanses of carving, so active and lively. Scores of twisting bodies, clutching hands, staring eyes, sniffing snouts, all jumbled together excitedly. A gymnasium of animal acrobats tying themselves into knots.
You have to get your eye in with Viking carvings, otherwise they can frighten you with all this amazing complication. It's all based on animal shapes, all interwoven and overlapping. So that, for example, is one animal. There's the head and there's the tail. And this figure 8 shape here, that's the whole of its body. And that's biting the tail of this animal here. And that animal is biting the tail of that animal, and so on. So imagine the 3D vision you need to carve this, the steady hand, the computer brain.
So if anyone ever says to you the Vikings were barbarous, grab them by the ear and tug them here to Oslo. Runes. More runes. and still more runes. All over Scandinavia, Norway, Denmark, and particularly here in Sweden, you find these magnificent standing stones left behind by the Vikings, covered in wobbly carvings and all these runes. Runes are the bits of writing on the twisty snakes. You usually find them on Viking gravestones. These ones here say Girior loved her husband and remembers him with her tears. Because they're carved on these mighty stones and not written down on handy bits of parchment or vellum, there's a tendency to mythologize them, to see great truths in the runes. According to Norse mythology, the runes were found by Odin, the supreme god of the Norsemen, while he was hanging from the Tree of Life, the famous Yggdrasil. For 9 days and nights, Odin stayed in the great tree, waiting, hoping, until eventually the runes fell into his hands and revealed themselves to him. Odin passed them to us. Thus, from the start, the runes were associated with magic and the mysteries of the cosmos. This splendid story about Odin up in the trees and the origin of the runes is another example of the extraordinary power that words had in these fateful years. Words, letters, symbols seemed to mean so much in the Dark Ages. They were so loaded, they had such resonance. It's actually quite a simple alphabet. So this shape here, that's a V sound. And that's an A, an L, and so on. So that says Waldemar. And in fact, this whole message is, here stands Waldemar in Viking land. The runic alphabet, or Futhark as it's called, had 24 letters in it originally. Later on, when the Vikings attacked Britain, they took the runes with them, and the Futhark grew to 33 letters. The new letters were needed to describe new sounds. Every time the Vikings conquered a new territory, and new words entered their language, they needed new letters to describe them. So, for example, originally there was no W, and I have to use a V sound for my name, Waldemar. So the runes were never some cobweb-covered dead language fit only for a museum. They were always alive, vibrant, and constantly changing. What a good-looking alphabet it is too. So energetic and upright. It's based on vertical lines, because verticals are easier to carve, particularly in wood, but also in stone. This vertical emphasis gives the runes a spiky presence and a mysterious relationship with time, as if every mark is somehow counting down the days. The Vikings were the last of the great barbarian nations to convert to Christianity. It wasn't till the 10th century, 1,000 years after the birth of Christ, that paganism's hold on the frozen north was broken. So around here, the paganism was stubborn. And in Viking art, it's often difficult to tell where the paganism ends and the Christianity begins. This is the biggest and most famous of all Scandinavian runestones, the Yelling Stone. It weighs over 10 tons. It's 2.5 meters tall, and as you can see, the entire stone seems to writhe with energy. What a fabulous thing. This inscription here, which goes all the way round, tells us that the Yelling Stone was put here by Harald Bluetooth, the energetic Viking ruler who's usually credited with converting the Danes to Christianity. I am Harold, it says here, son of Gorm, and I made the Danes Christians. It's carved on all 3 sides, and on this side there's an image of a giant snake attacking a stylized lion. Now obviously there are no lions in Scandinavia, it's an image they found abroad, but the Vikings identified with the lion's fighting spirit, so it pops up a lot in their art. It's an image they made theirs. Now I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, what lion and what snake? Well, inside the visitor centre at Yelling, there's a coloured replica of the Great Stone, which shows you how the lion and the snake would originally have looked before all their paint fell off. But the most surprising sight is here on the biggest side. It's the culmination of the entire stone. But you can't see it yet. The light has to be exactly right. What you have to do is wait till the twilight begins to work its magic. Can you see it? It's a splendid Viking crucifixion with this stern Christ in the centre, surrounded by all these writhing Viking knots. It's as if the whole stone can't keep still. And I like the way Christ hasn't actually got a cross. He's just standing there with his arms outstretched. So it's obviously another image that's been imported from abroad and is now being misunderstood so confidently. When the Vikings began behaving like Vikings and invaded Britain, they encountered the most exciting jewellers of the Dark Ages, the Anglo-Saxons. How do we know they were exciting? Because they've left behind this, the Sutton Hoo treasure. This is the finest hoard of Anglo-Saxon gold ever dug up in Britain. One of the great treasures of the British Museum. Just look at it. My legs go weak every time I see it, because it's in such excellent condition. Much of the art that survives from the Dark Ages has been battered by time, but not the Sutton Hoo treasure. In the finest pieces here, there's hardly a gram of gold bent out of place, or a garnet missing. The Sutton Hoo treasure was dug up out of the ground in East Anglia just a few weeks before the start of the Second World War in 1939. So it couldn't be investigated properly till after the war was over. And what a torture that must have been for the waiting archaeologists. The treasure dates from around 620 AD and comes from the grave of an important East Anglian king. The king was buried in a ship, his transport to the next world. And all this was buried with him to serve him in the afterlife.
These bits of sword here and the helmets mark him out as a mighty warrior. You wouldn't want to get on the wrong side of this man in heaven. They found a lyre in his grave as well, so the king could listen to his favourite music in the afterlife. That's a recreation of it. He had to eat well, so this fabulous cooking cauldron was buried with him. And look at all the intricate Celtic decoration around it. Most important of all, the people who buried the king made sure that he'd look good in the next world by burying him with his best Anglo-Saxon ruler bling, which is where this gold comes in, and those magnificent garnets.
If you've ever seen finer jewellery than this, let me know where, because I want to go there. How did they do it, these Anglo-Saxon wizards? To penetrate their secrets, I've tracked down a man who knows. In his youth, Sean Greenhouse was a skilled forger, and some of the world's greatest museums have admired his output.
Sean was finally caught and sent to prison, so he served his time, and these days puts all that expertise to much better use as an independent craftsman. The methods he uses aren't exactly the same as the methods of the Dark Ages. The modern world has changed too much for that, but they're about as close as you can get. And what Sean's work gives us is an insider's view of how Anglo-Saxon jewellers actually made their pieces. So Sean, can you tell us what it is you're going to be making?
Oh, it's an Anglo-Saxon disc brooch, silver with some enamel gilding, covering most of the aspects that the Anglo-Saxon jewellers would use.
They obviously had lots of different techniques in the way they made their jewellery. So which ones are you picking up here?
Well, this is probably 10th century. It's like a late Saxon disc brooch. The earlier ones were the gold and garnet mostly, but these are religious symbolism on these.
Is this based on a existing brooch?
No, it's my own design, but it kind of encompasses elements of other things, kind of. So it's an original design in itself. The centre part will be done in gold ribbon, cloisonné, different coloured enamels.
And that's a picture of an Anglo-Saxon king?
Yeah, just a generic long tash, beard, what have you, and a sword in his right hand. And the element I haven't actually put in is the hand of God over his shoulder. That'll be put in white and gold enamel.
Wonderful, well, let's get going.
Okay, let's get on with it.
The delights of Sean's Anglo-Saxon disc brooch will have to wait. First, we need to cross the Channel and search out those powerful Dark Age creatives, the Carolingians, rulers of the Franks.
The Franks were the ancestors of the modern French. Originally, they were Germans, just like the Anglo-Saxons. But they arrived in Gaul on one of those expansionist barbarian waves that we saw in film 2. And early in their story, the Franks converted to Christianity, and they became particularly fierce defenders of the faith.
Plenty of Dark Age societies liked their art to sparkle. A taste for gold is one of the Dark Age's defining characteristics. But when it comes to religious bling, the Frankish Christians were top of the charts.
If you've ever wondered why the French sometimes conduct themselves as if they were the chosen people, it's because that's exactly what they thought they were. In 732 AD, the Franks, led by the heroic Charles Martel, Charles the Hammer, defeated an invading Muslim army which had come up from Spain hoping to conquer Europe. The Franks believed God had chosen them to save Europe from Islam. They were his chosen people. And their art seems particularly aware of this special position in God's good books. The mightiest of the Frankish kings, Charles the Great, or Charlemagne as he's usually called, came from a dynasty called the Carolingians. He was crowned in 768 and with typical Frankish modesty pushed himself right to the front of Dark Age politics. Charlemagne was determined to expand the Frankish Empire. After all, it was God's chosen empire, and the Carolingians were God's chosen leaders. And this expansion of Charlemagne's Christian empire was achieved with deep brutality. In Germany, the Saxons, who were still pagans, were given a very simple choice: convert to Christianity or die. If they didn't become Christians, they were killed. That was Charlemagne's choice. In 800 AD, in Rome, on Christmas Day itself, the Pope rewarded Charlemagne for his efforts on behalf of Christianity by crowning him as the Holy Roman Emperor. Charlemagne was now the leader of the largest empire Europe had seen since the fall of the Romans. The centre of gravity of Europe had shifted, and it had shifted to the north. This is the chapel that Charlemagne built here in Aachen on the Belgian borders. And from here, he ruled his new Christian empire. And this is actually the marble throne on which he sat. There's a spooky simplicity to Charlemagne's throne. 4 slabs of ancient marble, a few metal clamps, 6 marble steps, and that's it. A gold-loving emperor is pretending to be a simple man. Charlemagne began building this chapel in 786 AD, and at exactly the same time, in Spain, the Muslims were building the Great Mosque in Cordoba, which I hope you remember from the last film. Such inventive and dramatic architecture, with those nimble double arches and that gorgeous forest of columns. Charlemagne's chapel, this chapel, was intended to be a deliberate riposte to the Muslims, a Christian answer to the Cordoba Mosque. Look up there at the arches and see how they have these alternating bands of colour, just like the arches in the Cordoba Mosque. But in Aachen, the stripy arches don't float or soar. Nothing does. This is architecture drawn with the biceps, not the wrist. Effortful and ponderous. I don't like this building. It feels brutal, clunky. This round shape was based originally on a Roman mausoleum, and you can still sense the doomy and cold atmospheres of the mausoleum in here. Gloomy, expensive, intense. Frankish Christianity bulldozes the senses. But it doesn't really pleasure them. At least I don't think so. In the battle of the northern Christians, give me Anglo-Saxon art any day. Christianity arrived in Britain from three directions at once in a three-pronged religious assault. In the south, in ancient Kent, a team of monks led by St. Augustine was sent here by the Pope in Rome, and they brought with them the official Roman version of Christianity. Up here, in the north of Britain, it was Irish monks from across the sea who came over to convert the pagans. And they brought with them a harsher, more basic, more penitential form of Christianity. They deliberately built their monasteries in difficult locations, and where they produced glorious art with an ecstatic and insistent tone to it, like the chanting of a great monk's choir. The third type of Christians found in Anglo-Saxon Britain were the ones who were already here. Remember in film 1 how the Romans converted to Christianity under Constantine, and how one of the earliest known Christian house churches was found in Roman Britain, in Lullingstone, in Kent. We don't know much about these existing Christians. They were a modest Christian presence. But perhaps tiny droplets of this modesty were thrown into the melting pot as well. So the Anglo-Saxons would have had wood-heated kilns? Or?
A charcoal brazier, I should imagine. This is the silver I'm going to make the brooch out of. It's basically about 82% silver, a bit of copper, quite a lot of lead, which designates as Anglo-Saxon or Viking, a few other bits and bats in it. All the trace elements you don't get in modern silver.
Sean melts down the Anglo-Saxon silver, and to turn it into something useful, pours it into some moulds made from cuttlefish bones. So tell me about this cuttlefish. Is this what was used in ancient times to make moulds?
It's been used for centuries. I should imagine it's a Roman tradition, actually. Take them out of the moulds, it should be relatively cool now. Right. That's the actual ingot there. That's for the pin and the pin mounds. So we'll quench that first of all.
That basically just cools it down.
And it cleans it, blowing all the stuff off. Right. The next thing to do is to reduce this piece of silver for the main body down to about 1.5 millimetres to replicate Anglo-Saxon disc brooches that are in existence. So first of all, we have to start with a beat from the centre to the outside. You've always got to outside to inside, inside to out, reversing it every time.
Basically you're making it thinner?
Yeah, basically, yeah. On the other side, you start in the centre and work to the middle. And that's so you keep a uniform thickness, because it tends to bowl to a natural bowl shape. It starts to split once you start to spread it out even further. You hear the dull thud of it now. As we hammer it, it gets higher and higher the pitch. And with the, you can tell when it's hard enough so you don't crack it. That's more or less brought it to the next stage. So it's just a matter of us now repeating the process and as we reduce it, the area will get larger. And once we've made a big enough piece out of it and reduced it to 1.5mm or thereabouts, we'll have a large enough piece to cut the disc out of. This is 1.5mm, as you can see. That is just the same as this, it's just the same silver. When I've worked on it, it'd take about 2 days work, hammer work, and a lot of ear bashing, falling out with your neighbours and what have you to get it to that. So we'll start on with this now.
I mean, that is the basic shape of the brooch,
This is the basic shape of the brooch.
While Sean Greenhalgh bangs away in his lair, back at the front line of the Dark Ages, the Anglo-Saxon custom of burying the dead with things that would be useful to them in the afterlife was, of course, a pagan custom. And, unfortunately, when the Anglo-Saxons were converted to Christianity, that custom was stopped. In a Christian burial, you buried the body and that was it. So nothing as sumptuous as the Sutton Hoo treasure has survived from the Christian era. Instead, we get another kind of Anglo-Saxon treasure.
It's a treasure made of granite and limestone. The resilient, spiritual treasure that is the Anglo-Saxon funeral cross.
Earlier on, we saw how the Vikings commemorated their dead with these mighty standing stones covered in runes. And this idea that stone is somehow eternal and lasts much longer than you is something that was shared by all the voyaging tribes of the north. There's something splendidly basic about these Anglo-Saxon crosses. They're supposed to be Christian, but somehow their Christianity feels superficial and confined to the surface. Underneath, you can still sense the atmospheres of Stonehenge, a connection with the faraway past and the central mysteries of creation. See all this decoration here? It's called interlacing. It's Celtic in origin, and you get it on the Anglo-Saxon crosses, but also on the great manuscripts written later in the monasteries, like Lindisfarne. A lot of people have written a lot of books on the subject of Celtic interlacing, what it means, why it was used. It's so beautiful to look at, but also so intrinsically mysterious. They say that its origins lie in basket weaving and plaiting, and we'll never know for sure. But my guess is that this is also an attempt by the Dark Age mind to grasp and mimic the rhythms of creation, to convey the sense that the cosmos goes on and on and on, and that everything in it is interrelated. This is a rather wonky specimen, which is why I like it so much. It's not quite right, so you just want to hug it. But because it's so wonky, the interlacing on the Lonnon Cross in the Isle of Man is particularly clear. We're going to be seeing a lot of this Celtic interlacing in the marvellous manuscripts that are coming up. So I just wanted to show you quickly how it was done. It looks immensely complicated, but it's actually relatively simple. So first you need to mark out a grid. Say we want to do a decorative border on a gospel book. So here's the border, And we know from unfinished bits of manuscript that the monks have left behind that the way they did it was to make this grid with dots to guide them. So they got 3 dots, 2 dots, 3 dots, 3 dots, 3 dots, 2 dots, 2 dots, 2 dots. So like the dots on a dice, 3, 2, 3, 2, 3, 2. Then you start filling in the spaces in between. Now the big rule in interlacing is that one line goes over and the other line goes under, over, under, over, under, over, under, all the way along. And when you're about to get to the edge, you stop, because you need to work out how you're going to do the edges. Now I'm just going to square them off. And that's the simplest way of doing it. But they also did all these elaborate things. They'd leave out bits of the pattern and create this kind of asymmetrical symmetry. It's too complicated for me, I'm afraid. And then once you've got your over, under, and you start to fill in the bits of the background. Red and black. There you are. A bit of Celtic interlacing. So I've done this very big because I've got insensitive and stubby fingers. But if you're a Dark Age monk poring over a precious manuscript, then the borders you made were tiny. I mean, these people must have had extraordinary eyesight. Of course, if you're a sculptor, on the other hand, once you've designed your interlacing, you need to carve it into stone. And that's mightily difficult too. And with this cross, the Lonan cross, you can see that the interlacing, it's okay when it begins up here, but as it comes down, it gets wonkier and wonkier and wonkier.
Back in Bolton, Sean Greenhouse has engraved the symbols of the 4 evangelists round the edges of his silver brooch. And he's now ready for the really difficult bit in the middle. The Anglo-Saxon king, created so carefully with cloisonné enamels.
The cloisonné enamel technique is a very old technique practiced by the Romans and the Celts even before them. It's just powdered glass, ground up and mixed in with water and then just fired in the kiln. But the Anglo-Saxons and other people in the Dark Age and into the Middle Ages would use Roman glass tesseras, ground up, the kind of thing you see in wall mosaics in Ravenna and such places, Constantinople and such. Because although they had the technology to make the glass, they didn't have the oxides to get the various colours, as you can see, the yellows and the greens and the blues.
The first stage is to lay down the king's outlines in a delicate framework of itsy-bitsy bits of pure gold.
So fiddly, these little bits, you know. The eyes and the nose.
Then the really tough work begins. Getting the powdered glass into this labyrinth of gold cells.
Right. Yeah, we're just filling in the background now, the dark blue. It's always better to get the background in first, the largest area, to fill the largest area, and it kind of holds most of the wires in position then, so you're not pushing everything about. So careful you don't drop any into the other cells, but otherwise it all has to be washed off if you do that, you know. Start again. It's right, just got to work out the colour schemes now. I think the yellows can go in next, so I'll mix some yellow. Right, here we go. Now, It's the difficult part to fill the small pieces because just touching them with it, the surface tension tends to like glue them to the damn brush. So slowly does it, I think. And then we'll put the tash in there. Long droopy head with the confessor tash. That's the hair, a bit yellow. A general Costa hairdo. It's just slow, fiddly work, you know. Always fighting the surface tension with it because. Right, pale green into the cloak itself, and then we're ready for firing when we've dried it out. So. Right.
While Sean prepares to pop his Anglo-Saxon king into the kiln, I'm thinking that his brooch reminds me strongly of the most famous of all Anglo-Saxon jewels, the so-called Alfred jewel. They say that originally it was the top of a reading implement sent out to the bishops by King Alfred himself. It's now found in the Ashmolean Museum in Oxford. And what a beautiful thing it is. So this style of brooch is obviously a late Anglo-Saxon.
Yeah, probably 10th century, I should imagine, yeah, in design.
I mean, a lot of people always say that the Anglo-Saxon jewellery was at its peak earlier than that. They think of the Sutton Hoo hoard.
Yeah, the garnet stuff and the garnet jewellery, the gold and what have you.
That's right.
Fashions change, I suppose. I prefer the later stuff. I think it's far more elegant and there's far more to it. Which, anyway, that's the Clasone finished.
Beautiful. So that's obviously an echo, if you like, of the Alfred jewel, isn't it?
Yeah. So it's kind of like a mishmash of various things, but it's all of its time and period. So
Can I have a look at that?
Yeah.
Oh, I see, yes. Beautiful. And who is this figure you've put on there? It's kind of King Alfred, is it?
Well, no, it's just a generic figure of a Saxon king, I suppose, with the long tash and the pointy beard, and the blonde hair and the blue eyes.
Beautiful.
Kind of very like to portray themselves, I should imagine. So, anyway, we just have to get on now and assemble it.
Yes.
So we'll do that next, shall we?
Yes.
Right. First thing to do is put the crystal into the silver gilt collar. And then that just drops into there. And then this piece will be riveted on the back with these little rivets, gilt-headed. So.
Yes.
So I'll put them in now. It's a little bit fiddly, this.
Yes.
And there we have it.
That it?
It's finished.
That's beautiful.
Thank you.
The Sean Greenhouse jewel.
You can move it about in the light, you can get the edges of the actual gold plus on it, and it kind of sparkles, yeah.
Beautiful. I love cloisonné work. I love it. Up in the harsher corners of the Anglo-Saxon world, the Irish monks who converted the north of Britain were deliberately cutting themselves off from life's little comforts. Exiles for Christ, they called themselves. Lindisfarne up there, where the monastery was founded by St. Aidan in 635 AD, was deliberately out of the way, secluded. When the tide was out, the only way across was along this path here, the Pilgrim's Way it was called, marked out with these wooden stakes. But if you were coming from the other side of the island, from the sea, then Lindisfarne wasn't cut off at all. In fact, it was very tempting. The Viking raids on Britain, which did so much to tarnish the reputations of the Norsemen, began with a raid on Lindisfarne in 793. And for the next century or so, the Vikings kept coming back. Monasteries were easy pickings.
They were basically undefended, manned by peaceful monks. And they were packed with sumptuous religious treasures and excellently positioned for Viking raids.
The monasteries of the Dark Ages were Aladdin's caves of treasures. Jewel-encrusted relic boxes, golden crosses studded with rubies and pearls. We live in a world in which Louis Vuitton luggage and Jimmy Choo shoes seem precious. In the Dark Ages, they knew better.
For the Vikings, the main attraction of the monasteries was obviously all that fabulous Christian gold in them, the rubies, the pearls. But it's recently been suggested that there were other reasons why they targeted the monasteries, religious reasons. Remember, in 793 AD, when they raided Lindisfarne, the Vikings were still hardcore pagans, stubborn believers in Odin, Thor, and Freya.
For these pagan Vikings, the fierce missionary enthusiasm of the Irish monks and the brutal conversion tactics of Charlemagne constituted an assault on their religion.
The Vikings liked being pagans. They didn't like being told they were worshipping the wrong gods. So when they attacked the monasteries, it wasn't just to grab all this fabulous Christian loot. It was also a form of religious payback. You think our religion's wrong. We think your religion's wrong.
The monks on Lindisfarne were also fighting a religious war. Their monastery was a hive of busy missionary activity. But unlike the Vikings, the preferred weapon of the monks wasn't the sword, but the word.
You must have noticed that all the way through this series, I've been harping on about the power of words in the Dark Ages. I'm like a stuck record on the subject.
Words, letters, inscriptions. They keep appearing in this story, and wherever they appear, they seem to glow with Dark Age urgency.
If you controlled the word in the Dark Ages, you controlled the world. And for me, the most captivating evidence of this immense power that words had is the great book created here by the monks of Lindisfarne. The Lindisfarne Gospels.
This isn't just one of the great masterpieces of British art. This is one of the great masterpieces of all art. Written and decorated on Lindisfarne by a monk called Edfrith, the Lindisfarne Gospel contains a calligraphic cosmos of exceptional vitality.
It contains the four Gospels of the New Testament, the story of Christ as told by Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. And each of these evangelists gets a portrait to himself. So there's St. Matthew writing his Gospel, and it says Matthäus, Matthew, up here. All the portraits in here are rather traditional. They could easily be Italian or Byzantine. But then you turn the pages and you come across this. And this certainly isn't traditional or Italian. This is a uniquely British contribution to the art of the Dark Ages. Look at all this amazing Celtic interweaving that's filling all the letters, and all these cosmic swirls and twirls and spirals. It's like a magnificent garden of paradise that's erupted across the pages. And yet, it's got this pagan kick to it as well. This is St. John, the writer of the fourth Gospel. That's his portrait. And there above his head, the eagle, that's his sign, just so we know who it is. And this is the actual beginning of John's Gospel. And look how astonishingly beautiful it is. And do you know what this says? What all this amazingly complicated interlacing and all this cosmic calligraphy, do you know what this says? It says, in principio erat verbum, et verbum erat apud Deum. In the beginning was the Word. The Word was with God. In the Lindisfarne Gospel, Christian energy and Celtic inventiveness, pictures and letters have come together in cosmic adulation of the Word. So that's the story of the Dark Ages. They weren't dark at all. The Christians' struggle to imagine their God was one of the most exciting struggles in art. The barbarians were inventive peoples who made glorious bling. Islam spent these years reaching for the stars, while the Anglo-Saxons were magnificent goldsmiths and brilliant wordsmiths. When William the Conqueror invaded Britain in 1066 and brought the Dark Ages to some sort of official end, he brought to an end one of the great ages of art.